Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Night Scare's story. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from if you're enjoying the stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe now. Let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. Audrey was determined to find the culprit, but everyone looked so suspicious. Audrey adjusted her halter-neck swimming costume, tucked a loose strand of hair inside her rubber cap, and picked up her towel. The Lido changing room was quiet this early in the morning. Regardless of the season, she and her friends, Betty, Frank, and Cameron, met every day before work to take a quick dip. She wondered if she should wait for Betty, but decided to take the plunge before the others arrived. Outside, the enormous pool glistened in the pale sunlight. The slide and diving board at the far end were empty. The fountain hadn't been turned on yet, and the shop and cafe were still closed. Audrey could see the lifeguard inside the building, chatting to Vera as she set up for the day. Audrey dumped her towel on one of the many sun loungers positioned around the pool edge, sat down and dangled her feet in the water. As she looked up, she saw something floating at the far end. It looked too long to be a ball and too small for a lilo. Perhaps someone had left their towel behind and it had blown into the water. She couldn't see very well as she'd left her glasses in the changing room, but she thought she ought to rescue it. She got up and wandered round to take a closer look. As she drew nearer, it was clear it wasn't a towel at all, and her heart began to beat faster. Her breath caught in her throat. Couldn't be, could it? Her eyes must be playing tricks on her. However, a few steps nearer and there was no doubt. It was a body, a woman's body. Audrey felt an icy shiver pass through her, and she moved closer, peering at the girl before her. There, fully clothed and floating on the surface, was Betty. Her face was as white as the railings and her eyes were staring lifelessly at the sky. Frank and Cameron had just left the male changing rooms and, as she let out a piercing scream and staggered backwards, they raced towards her, closely followed by the lifeguard. "What is it, Audrey? Are you all right?" Frank reached her first, then stopped in horror as his eyes fell on Betty. "It can't be. How?" He froze, transfixed. Cameron had stopped a little further away, his face drained of color. "Betty," he choked out. Audrey sobbed, her body shaking uncontrollably, and Frank pulled himself together. He wrapped her in his towel and led her to a seat. "We'll call the police," he said quietly. Later that day, the three friends were sitting in Audrey's front room. They hadn't been able to face going to work, and the police inquiries had taken up most of the morning anyway. Audrey's mother, Ida, had made them lunch, but her daughter had found she could eat very little. She couldn't get the image of Betty's body out of her mind. "I think you might all be in need of something stronger than tea today," Ida declared. To Audrey's surprise, her mother went to the sideboard, took out her father's brandy bottle and poured them each a drink. Ida noticed her daughter's raised eyebrows and smiled kindly. "Purely medicinal," she said, handing a cup to Frank with a wink. "Thank you, Mrs. Maynard. It's really been a terrible shock," he said. Cameron nodded in agreement. Audrey was very grateful for her mother's solid presence as she bustled about in her housecoat, taking care of them. "I just don't understand it," she burst out. "Who could possibly have wanted to kill Betty? She didn't have an enemy in the world. Everyone liked her." She stared around the room, blinking back tears. In the familiar, everyday surroundings, it was hard to believe it had happened and that she hadn't just imagined it all. The electric fire was still in the tiled fireplace, the mirror hanging from its chain above. The black and white TV, bought for the coronation, was in the corner. They were seated on the same bulky brown sofas, with their antimacassars, that had always been here. Audrey sighed and Frank cast her an anxious glance. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm sorry you were the one who found Betty. You've had such a shock." "I'll be all right," she told him, sipping the brandy. "It's been a dreadful day for all of us." "Are you okay, Cameron?" He nodded. "I just can't help thinking that I only saw her yesterday. Everything was fine." His voice trailed away. "Oh yes," Ida remarked. "I saw the two of you chatting in the high street. You were carrying that large box, and she looked so well, wearing that pretty red dress with her gorgeous bouffant hair." She shook her head and topped up Cameron's cup. "It will take time, but eventually you will heal," she told them. Audrey hoped Mother was right. She was worried about Cameron. She hadn't known him for as long as Frank and Betty, but he'd been white as a sheet all day and not himself at all. Perhaps he'd been sweet on her friend? Actually, it was through Betty's ex-boyfriend that they'd first met Cameron. He and Noel worked together, and that memory gave her a horrid idea. Her hand flew to her mouth. It couldn't be Noel, could it? She asked. He always seemed so nice. But he was devastated when Betty broke up with him. Frank's eyes widened and he swallowed. You could be on to something there, Audrey, he stated. He seemed decent, but he was devoted to her. I thought he'd struggle to get over it. Cameron nodded somberly. You're both right, he said, frowning, and I don't like to tell you this, but there have also been some thefts at work. The bosses have been talking to Noel about it. He might not be a trustworthy fellow after all. Goodness, how awful. A thief and a murderer, is it possible? Audrey's blue eyes were wide, and she fiddled with her pearls distractedly. Could she believe this of Noel? It was true that he was the quiet type, and he dropped them all after his breakup with Betty. But still, it is hard to believe, Frank agreed. But he had motive, and I guess he had opportunity too. He knew Betty's routine, and he could have gone to the Lido early to meet her. That's true, Audrey agreed. I think it's very likely, especially since it might have been an accident, Cameron added. Perhaps Noel had gone there to win Betty back. They'd quarreled, and he'd pushed her over. It was a knock to the head that had killed her, according to the police. She hadn't drowned. A few days later, the trio were back at the Lido. They hadn't felt able to resume their morning swims, but instead they were hoping to find evidence. Now she was feeling a little better. Audrey was determined to get justice for her friend. They would get to the bottom of this murder one way or another. Morning, Ernie, they greeted the attendant at the kiosk. How are you three today? He responded. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. It's good to see you back here. Ernie often manned the east entrance to the Lido, collecting the 2D fee and passing the time of day with folk. What can I do to help you this fine morning? He asked. I don't think you've come for a swim. He looked pointedly at their empty arms. No towels in sight. We're trying to find out what happened to Betty, Frank told him. We want to be sure the culprits brought to justice. Ernie seemed taken aback. I'm happy to do what I can, but don't you think you'd best leave it to the police? He suggested. I wouldn't want you getting into trouble. Perhaps Ernie's right? Cameron looked anxious, but the others shook their heads. We're not interfering with the police inquiry, Audrey said. It can't hurt if we find out some things as well. Ernie looked doubtful, but he smiled. What can I do? He asked. We wanted to know who came into the Lido that morning, Frank stated. There must have been someone else around. Ernie scratched his head and looked thoughtful. You know, I've been wondering about that myself, he said, but there wasn't anyone else. Miss Betty came in first. Then I saw Audrey and then the gents. You didn't see Noel Crayford? Audrey asked. No, not him, nor anyone else, Ernie confirmed. My guess is that someone came in by the west gate. Maybe try Vera? She could have seen something from the shop. Vera. At the mention of her name, Audrey had a moment of revelation. If no one else had entered the Lido that morning, then it had to be someone who was already here. Someone like Vera. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Frank was watching her closely. She nodded. It's possible. She's always here early. But what motive does she have? Audrey pointed out. Cameron looked uncertain. It could be her, he muttered. I don't think they got on very well. Didn't they have a big argument recently? Yes, Audrey agreed, her face grim. They never got on. I think Vera's always been jealous of Betty. She used to bully her at school, and she was sweet on Noel, too. They said goodbye to Ernie and wandered through to the pool. A couple of people in white rubber hats were plowing up and down. Audrey avoided looking at the far end, where she had found Betty's body. Instead, she directed her eyes towards the changing rooms and cafe. It was a lovely morning. The sun glinted from the glass and horse chestnuts waved on the far side of the wall. She took a deep breath and entered the shop. Vera looked up as they came in and frowned. What do you lot want? She asked. I'm surprised you've got the nerve to show your faces here. What are you talking about? Audrey asked, taken aback. One of you is a murderer. I'd have thought you'd be keeping a low profile, Vera said. Betty was our friend. You're the one who was nasty to her, Audrey pointed out. She was a horrible stuck-up thing, but I'm not the violent kind. Are you sure about that? Frank stepped forward in Audrey's defense. Ask the lifeguard if you don't believe me. I dare say it was her, Vera added, pointing spitefully at Audrey. They're one as bad as the other. Clearly, we'll learn nothing sensible here. Frank turned on his heel and the others followed him out. A few days later, Audrey and Frank were making their way along the road towards Cameron's house. It had turned chilly and Audrey pulled her wool coat tightly around her, glad of her hat and gloves. Frank strode beside her in his trilby and scarf, his shoes shining, ready for work. A mother with a large pram walked past them and a Hillman Minx drove by on its way into town. I'm sorry about Vera, Frank said to her. I hope you're not upset. Really, Frank, I'm fine, Audrey assured him. He'd asked her this every morning since they'd gone back to the Lido. If it wasn't for the lifeguard giving her an alibi, I'd be certain she'd done it, he went on. Audrey shook her head and sighed. Vera was pretty rotten to Betty at school, but I think underneath she just feels inadequate. Well, I suppose that's tough. Frank stroked his chin. I didn't like the way she spoke to you. And to accuse you of murdering your own friend. Audrey smiled. Frank was becoming very protective of her, and he looked very handsome, striding beside her in the sunshine. Let's not think about Vera, she suggested. I just hope Cameron's all right. I still don't think he's himself. We'll soon see. Frank smiled down at her. They reached Cameron's front door and rang the bell. His mother, Martha, answered, looking flustered. Oh, come in, you two, she invited them. They entered and followed her to a small sitting room. I'm afraid you've missed Cameron this morning, Martha told them. He's gone off early, but do sit down. Let me get you some tea. Frank glanced at his watch and looked as if he might refuse, but Audrey took pity on Martha. That would be lovely, she said. They would still make it to work on time, after all. I don't know what's got into that boy, Martha told them a few minutes later, as she poured tea into china cups. He's coming and going at very funny hours. He goes out at the crack of dawn sometimes, including meeting you all at 7 the day that poor girl died. Audrey and Frank's eyes met in shock. They always got to the Lido for 7:45 a.m., but Cameron had been early. He was really late home last night, too, Martha continued. Had to talk to his boss about these transistor radio thefts at work. He's not been himself for a while. Martha looked really upset and Audrey didn't know what to say. Her mind was whirling, and there was a knot forming in her stomach. What did all this mean? Don't worry, Mrs. Chatham. We'll keep an eye on him, she said. Audrey glanced gratefully at Frank. Hopefully he could soothe Cameron's mother. Audrey had something she must do. I'm sorry, but may I powder my nose? She asked. Of course, dear. Top of the stairs, Martha replied. Audrey slipped out of the room and climbed up the stairs. She paused on the landing and looked about. Which one could be Cameron's room? Quietly, she opened a couple of doors until she found it. She went inside, rapidly opening and closing wardrobes, a large chest, and eventually searching under the bed. She was about to give up when she felt something in the far back corner. She could do with a torch, but since she didn't have one, she slid herself right underneath. Her fingers closed over the edge of a cardboard box, and she pulled it out carefully. Dusting herself down, she opened the lid. To her horror, though not complete surprise, nestling inside were a number of Pi P123 BQ transistor radios, worth around 18 pounds each. She gasped. Cameron was the thief, and she feared that he might be more than that. Audrey and Frank sat at a table in a cafe, listening to Elvis Presley issuing from the radio. They each had a milkshake in front of them, and they were discussing the previous day's events, trying to make sense of it all. Cameron was in custody and had confessed both to theft and to manslaughter. It's so hard to take in, Audrey said, sipping the ice-cold drink. I know we hadn't known him for long, but he was one of our friends. Frank nodded grimly. It's very shocking, but at least Betty will get justice now. He gazed at Audrey admiringly. You were so clever to work it all out. It was the mothers who made me think of it, she explained. Martha telling us that Cameron was a suspect in the thefts, and that he'd arrived early at the Lido. Then I remembered what my own mother said about the cardboard box he was carrying. The day he'd met Betty in the high street. Yes, Frank nodded. The box full of stolen transistors. Betty must have put 2 and 2 together and realized he was the thief. And when he met her at the Lido, she threatened to tell on him. They argued and he pushed her over. Frank took Audrey's hand and she felt a little better. If Vera hadn't been so busy chatting up the lifeguard, she might have seen him, she murmured. That's true, but thanks to you, the crime's been solved anyway, he returned. Frank was right, and Audrey had to admit that it felt good to have helped her dear friend. As she held Frank's warm hand in her own, she was filled with hope for their future. Story number 2. Judy knew they would have to do some digging to get to the bottom of this case. Detective Sergeant Judy McLeish wiped her forehead with her hand. The whole country was basking in the 10th week of the hottest weather anyone could remember, and people were irritable and fed up. As Judy approached her desk, she noticed a spade on Bill's work surface, the blade shiny and the shop label still attached. She frowned. Nice, isn't it? Bill said. Got it for Marie for her birthday. Judy glanced up to see if he was joking. He wasn't smiling. Are you sure? She asked. Bill nodded. On the few occasions she'd met Marie, Judy had got the impression that Bill's wife didn't share his fascination with allotments. She might prefer flowers or chocolates, Judy said. Bill narrowed his eyes. Nonsense. McLeish, what did you get her last year, sir? Cheers. And very useful they've been. For Marie. Bill looked at her, his mouth slightly open. But before he could answer, a uniformed constable hurried over and handed him a note. A body, Bill said, squinting at the paper. On the Farlow estate, at the site of an archaeological dig. Judy's heart skipped. She was tired of burglaries because doors were left open and complaints about banned hosepipe usage. Probably old bones, Bill said. But we'll check. Judy wound down the window of Bill's Allegro and leaned back in the passenger seat. The noise of the road and other traffic made conversation impossible. They entered the estate through impressive wrought iron gates and followed the driveway until they reached the house. Where's the dig? Judy asked as they got out. Across the fields behind the house, they set off. The sun was hot on Judy's head and soon rivulets of sweat ran down her back. Bill looked worse. Too many pub lunches and too much desk work had left him red in the face and breathing heavily. I thought the allotment kept you fit, Judy said. Bill winced as she took pity and slowed her pace. In the distance, Judy could make out figures and a cluster of canvas tents with a larger bell-shaped one in the center. Judy paused to take in the scene. Several trenches had been dug, the piles of soil dry and dusty, but nobody was working as everyone crowded around the hole furthest from them. The group was mostly young, sunburned, and wore light clothing and floppy hats. As Bill and Judy approached, they stepped back to allow them access. 2 women were in a pit clearing soil from round a body. Out! Bill's voice was shrill. Everybody stared at him. We need experts, Bill said. One of the women in the pit looked up. We are experts, she said mildly. You won't get anyone more expert at digging things up than us. You are destroying evidence. I insist you stop and get out, Bill said. The woman shrugged and held out a hand to the people above her, who pulled her out. Judy stepped closer. An elderly man with gray hair, dressed in a short-sleeved shirt and slacks. His hands crossed over his chest, lay below. Soil had been cleared from round him. He could have been asleep. Not old bones, then, she murmured to Bill. Definitely not old bones. The woman from the pit held out her hand. Dr. Michaela Southern. I'm leading this dig. We rarely find bones. This is a Roman site and bodies would likely have been incinerated or buried in a pit away from town. Judy saw Bill straighten up before answering. Dr. Southern, he said. Who found the body? Well, we all did, really. Dr. Southern gave them a broad smile. Sonia, one of my students, was the first here this morning and she raised the alarm. Bill cocked an eyebrow. She shouted, Dr. Southern explained, that the pit had been filled overnight. It's taken us weeks to dig the trenches, so we were pretty annoyed, and we started digging. The infill is easy to remove. After a few inches, we realized something was buried in the trench. Everyone saw him exposed. And do you recognize the body, Dr. Southern? Bill asked. Oh yes, it's Mr. Farlow. This is his estate. 2 hours later, just as Judy thought she could take no more of standing out in the sun, the police doctor confirmed Mr. Farlow had died sometime overnight, possibly from a blow to the back of the head. None of the archaeologists admitted to hearing anything. We'll go and see the Farlow family, Bill said. Murder, sir. Well, Mr. Farlow didn't bury himself, so it's suspicious. Bill frowned. They plodded back towards the house, Judy wondering how the archaeologists survived outside all day. A woman in a black uniform and white apron opened the door. Judy blinked. She'd never been anywhere with servants before. We're here to speak with Mrs. Farlow, Bill said. The woman admitted them to a large, marbled hallway with a broad central staircase. It was beautifully cool, and Judy wanted to pull her shoes off and walk barefoot on the cold floor. Mrs. Farlow will see you in the drawing room, the woman in black said. Judy followed Bill into a comfortable room with 2 big sofas on either side of a fireplace, dimly lit as the shutters were closed. A WPC was sitting to one side, but Mrs. Farlow did not appear upset at her husband's death. Mrs. Farlow? Bill said. Inspector William Durbin and Detective Sergeant Judy McLeish. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Farlow said. Can I get you a drink? Lemonade? It's very hot out, isn't it? That would be most kind, Bill said. Judy stifled a sigh of relief. We're sorry for your loss, Bill said, but I'm afraid we need to ask you some questions. Certainly, Mrs. Farlow said. Please have a seat. Judy sat down gratefully. Now she had a closer look. She could see Mrs. Farlow was considerably younger than the man in the trench. She had long blonde hair that was tied back loosely in a ponytail, and she wore a floral dress. Judy's skirt and shirt were sticking to her after the walk back and forth across the fields, and her hair was damp and limp. There was a knock at the door, and Ida came back in with a tray of tall glasses. Judy accepted one and took a huge glug. Bill put his glass down as he took out his notebook. When did you see your husband last, Mrs. Farlow? Yesterday. We had dinner together as usual, and you didn't notice he was missing this morning? Mrs. Farlow shook her head. No, Inspector. We lead different lives. I don't keep track of him. I was up early and went for a ride before it got too hot for me or the horses. Did anyone see you? Mrs. Farlow looked up. No. Oh yes. Ida was just coming in to prepare breakfast as I returned. I expect she saw me. You say you lived different lives? Bill asked, looking up at Mrs. Farlow. I am the second wife, Inspector, Mrs. Farlow said. Tristan loved his first wife and has 2 children by her. She died 15 years ago, and he remarried a younger woman to have on his arm at events. His children didn't approve, but the marriage suits us both. He did what he wanted, which this summer seems to have involved digging up the grounds in search of a Roman villa. And I have my horses. Ida, the woman who admitted them, was in the kitchen, a basement room with only small windows near the ceiling. It was, however, fitted with units and a cooker. It was a pleasant temperature to work in, but Ida wasn't working. She was sitting in a chair and sobbing gently. Have you worked here long? Bill asked. 30 years, Ida said. Mrs. Farlow employed me. The first Mrs. Farlow, that is. She gave a small sniff. You'll have seen a lot of changes here, Bill said. Oh yes, I've watched the children grow up. I helped nurse Mrs. Farlow when she was sick. And how are the new Mrs. Farlow and Mr. Farlow together? Ida's mouth turned down. I don't rightly know, she said. They were amicable. No rose or anything, but it isn't like the first wife. When did you last see Mr. Farlow? Bill asked. Last night when I served them dinner. Just a salad. Mrs. Farlow says it's too hot to eat at the moment. But I slipped a chicken breast on to Mr. Farlow's plate. And Mrs. Farlow? Judy asked. When did you last see her? Ida sniffed again. This morning, I suppose, she said. Just as I was coming across from my flat. She was coming back from the stables. Been out for a ride, no doubt. Prefers those horses to anything else, she does. Where were you last night? Bill asked. I finished clearing up after dinner and then went back to my flat and watched television. You heard and saw nothing unusual? Ida shook her head. And finally, Bill said, do you have dealings with anyone at the dig? Ida shook her head. Mr. Farlow gave them permission. Apparently there might be a Roman villa there, but as far as I know they've not found anything. Mr. Farlow goes up there most days. Has me make cakes for them sometimes. To energize them, he says. She thinned her lips. Come on, McLeish, Bill said, setting off across the fields again, the chat with Ida appearing to have reinvigorated him. What are you thinking, sir? She asked. Well, Mrs. Farlow has no alibi. And nor does Ida. I don't think it was Ida, Judy said. I'd say she was sweet on Mr. Farlow. Bill looked at her in surprise. Didn't you notice the way she talked about him? Judy said. I suppose, Bill said. And I doubt she would gain from his death. But Mrs. Farlow, on the other hand, we don't know that, Judy said. Maybe he left her nothing and everything goes to his children? We need to check, Bill said. But first I want to know when Mr. Farlow was at the dig. When they got back to the site, the students had left and the trench that had contained Mr. Farlow's body had been cleared. They went into the largest tent. Dr. Southern? The archaeologist looked up from her clipboard. Inspector, you're back. Judy watched the woman brush hair from her face with a grubby hand. A few questions, Bill said. We've been told that Mr. Farlow spent a lot of time here at the dig. He's very interested. I think he hoped for a big find, a mosaic floor or a hypocaust system, perhaps. Why? Bill asked. He wanted to open the site to the public. If it's a fine villa, it could become quite popular, and then the cafe and the shop. She made a moue of disgust. And have you found a villa? Judy asked. Dr. Southern shook her head. A wall. We have a few bits of pottery identifiable as Roman, especially the neck of an amphora, but no villa. Did Mr. Farlow come here yesterday? Bill asked. Dr. Southern ran a hand through her hair. He came every day to see how we were doing. He was very insistent that we keep digging. It's draining in this heat. The following morning, when Judy arrived at work, she noticed the spade was no longer on Bill's desk, but had been put against the wall. Poor Marie, she thought. How many years had they been married? Morning, sir, she said. Ah, McLeish, Bill said. We have an appointment with Farlow's solicitor this morning. Right, sir. You think the wife was involved? Bill's eyes narrowed. Always start with family, McLeish. They have the most to lose or gain. She didn't seem that cut up about his death. But did she have the strength to put him in the trench and bury him? Judy asked. She's a horsewoman, Bill pointed out. What about Ida? Judy asked. I'm not ruling anyone out. At 11 a.m., they were shown into the solicitor's office. They sat in front of a huge mahogany desk that was piled with folders. What can you tell us about Mr. Farlow's estate? Bill asked. The family is provided for. Mrs. Farlow stays in the house until her death, when it passes to the children. Mr. Farlow also made a provision for each of them of £50,000. Bill drew in a breath through his teeth. Not an insubstantial sum, he said. Mr. Farlow didn't make any changes to his will recently? No, the solicitor steepled his fingers. But when I last saw him, I did get the feeling that all might not have been well. What do you make of that? Bill asked when they were back on the street. The money gives the children a motive, Judy said. Mrs. Farlow is no better or worse off. We should interview the children next, Bill said. Or we could do a little more digging, Judy said. I'd like to see Ida again. Okay, Bill said. I'll visit the children. They're local, I believe. I'll catch you later. Judy went back to the Farlow estate. Mrs. Farlow isn't here, Ida said as she opened the door. It's you I'd like to speak to, Judy said. Ida invited her inside, but before she could lead the way to the basement, Judy stopped and pointed at an alcove in the hallway. That looks as if it should contain something, she said. Ida appeared flustered. It used to. Mr. Farlow said he was taking them for valuation. There was a bronze statue either side. How long have they been gone? Judy asked. A while, Ida admitted. Have other things vanished? Ida pressed her lips together. Yes. Several pictures from upstairs and some silverware. And the other day, I couldn't see the first Mrs. Farlow's jewelry. When Judy got back to the office, she was buzzing with what she'd found. Bill slung his jacket over the back of his chair and slumped down. Well, the children don't need the inheritance, he said. Both are pretty well heeled. Judy explained what she'd found out. Good work, McLeish, Bill said, and Judy felt a flush of warmth that for once wasn't related to the weather. The bank tomorrow, Bill said. Next morning, they were shown into the bank manager's office. He was reluctant to divulge information. It's a murder inquiry, Bill said. He sat upright and glared at the manager. Yes, but I can get the necessary authority, Bill said. And I can make a big song and dance about it. Bring lots of uniforms. That won't be necessary. The bank manager gave a tight smile. Mr. Farlow was having liquidity problems. A few investments had gone belly up. But he told me he had a new project on the go. It was going to create a steady income. Did he say what it involved? Bill asked. Well, there was some capital outlay. He took a big chunk of the remaining funds from his account to subsidize whatever it was. I advised against it, but he was insistent. Insistent, Bill said when they were back in the car. Dr. Southern used that term, too. I rather think Mr. Farlow's insistence was his downfall. You think it was someone from the dig? Judy asked. Could be, Bill said. It was late in the afternoon when Judy and Bill arrived at the site again. Have you found a villa, Dr. Southern? Bill asked. Not you as well. Dr. Southern put her hands on her hips. These things take time. Do you think you will find anything? Dr. Southern made a face. I'm not sure, she said. And did that bother Mr. Farlow, do you think? Judy saw Dr. Southern pause before answering. He wasn't happy, she conceded. Was he putting pressure on you? For a moment it looked as if Dr. Southern wouldn't answer, but then her shoulders appeared to sink. He was a bully, she said. He had no idea how a dig works and how unusual it is to make a great find. We argued. He pushed me. I pushed back. He fell and banged his head. And you didn't get help? There was no point. It was too late. But he brought it on himself. We'll have to let a jury decide that one, Bill said. Cuff her, Sergeant. Do you know, sir, you can get memberships to visit historic houses and Roman villas and such? Judy said on the drive back to the station. I've always fancied being able to visit places like that whenever I wanted. A month later, Judy was out in town. The air had an unusual feel. Then a cool breeze ruffled her hair and a drop of rain fell from the sky. Judy looked up and smiled. She caught the eye of a woman next to her and realized it was Marie. Judy, Marie said, I believe I owe you thanks. Me? Whatever for. Bill gave me a membership for my birthday. Now we can visit historic houses and castles, if I can get him away from the allotment. When I told him it was the best present he'd given me, he confessed the idea had come from you. It came from a case, actually, Judy said. But I'm glad you approve. As Marie smiled and waved, Judy walked on. I wonder what Bill did with the spade, she thought. Perhaps he'd had enough of digging for a while. Story number 3. There was something about this couple that caught Lucy's attention in this mystery set in 1976. They're predicting, Lucinda's mum began, that this year is going to be an absolute scorcher. Ah, Lucy replied, checking her appearance before setting off for her late shift at the seaside hotel where she worked. The short form of her name was her preference. Lucinda, what had her parents been thinking of? A good summer will please D opposite. Her mum continued. You're not listening, are you? No, I am, Lucy protested. Something about D. D owned the large house at the corner of their road, ran it as a guest house, and had been grumbling about visitor numbers being down, with everyone now going abroad for their holidays. Better weather than here was the usual reason put forward, so a good summer would benefit her. There are enough people staying at Dee's place as it is, Lucy's dad joined in. With the parking on the road being oversubscribed because of Dee's guests, he was having trouble finding somewhere to put his van. Okay, I must be off, Lucy said, opening the front door and setting out into the late afternoon sunshine. The hotel wasn't far from her home and normally only took 5 minutes. Presently, though, she reckoned you could at least double that, forever having to slow your pace because of the increased number of people on the streets of the little former fishing village. This continued into the evening, with the shops and cafes round the harbor all, for the duration of the season, staying open late. As she wove her way along, Lucy reflected on how different it would be in just a few months. Then, if you tried to buy something after 5 o'clock, you didn't stand a chance. Lucinda, Mr. Barnes the manager, or Barney, as everyone called him, greeted her as she entered the hotel. "Will you help in the Lighthouse Bar tonight? It'll be busy. We've had a big coach party arrive." The Lighthouse Bar, open to the public as well as residents, was so called because it had a wonderful sea view, including the lighthouse. Despite what Barney had said, the bar wasn't that busy at first, and Lucy found herself thinking about whether numbers were down in the hotel as well as at places like D's. She'd left school not that long ago with 3 A-levels, but without a clue about what she wanted to do. Because it was summer, she'd easily found work in a restaurant, then at another hotel, and then at this one, without necessarily intending to stay in that industry. But here she was, a couple of years on. Was it time to consider something else? With the bar remaining quiet, she proceeded to do precisely that. Those computer things, everyone said they were the industry of the future. Could she train for a job in that field? Get in at the start and make a name for herself? She spent a few pleasant minutes happily fantasizing, then changed her mind. Machines weren't really her forte. The telephone switchboard on reception she found challenging enough. A noise at the entrance to the bar brought her attention back to the bar. A group of women were coming in. All of them were dressed in what looked to Lucy like expensive clothes, but frankly she thought they'd wasted their money. Their attire was very ordinary, except perhaps for the shoulder bag one of them had. Fashion was one of her major enthusiasms, and she reckoned she was good at it. People were always admiring her outfits. How about training to be a designer? She thought, wondering why the idea hadn't occurred to her before. For another few minutes she pictured herself at one of the big shows, Paris or somewhere, everyone admiring her new collection. "A lager, please," a voice said. Lucy looked up into the eyes of what she thought was probably the most handsome man she'd ever seen. "And a babycham with a cherry in it." He completed his order. Babychams were a woman's drink, and now she saw, standing alongside him, a girl as striking as he was. Someone like him was bound to have a girlfriend, Lucy thought as she added a cherry to the babycham. She was busy then for a time. When she was just about to get herself a glass of water, an excited yell sounded across the bar. The handsome guy was at the huge window, pointing. "There's a dolphin out there," he cried. Suddenly everyone was on their feet and beside him at the window. Alas, it was a false alarm. "Where?" an older man asked the handsome one. "I don't know." Mr. Handsome shook his head. "I was sure I saw one. Maybe it was just the moon's reflection or something." Long days though they were, it was starting to get dark and the moon had risen. Mr. Handsome, looking embarrassed by his mistake, departed then, along with his girlfriend. The next day, Lucy was working from midday until early evening. The hotel was popular for afternoon teas. There were fancy teapots and scones with jam and cream. As she was going in, she saw the woman whose shoulder bag she'd thought was nice talking to Marina, the receptionist. "So I'm not sure where I lost it. It could have been in a shop, but it could have been here." The woman finished what she was saying. She put the bag on the desk so Marina could examine it. "Yes, I see," Marina replied. "It's easy for things to fall out." Lucy saw that the bag had a design flaw in terms of practicality. It didn't have a zip or anything across the top. If she went ahead with the designer thing, she'd make sure she didn't make mistakes like that. After the teas had finished, Lucy took over from Marina for a couple of hours and then set off home. The streets had a contented feeling. There were people returning to their accommodation from a day on the beach, all healthy and glowing and looking forward to their evening meal. Others were coming from their accommodation to go out, perhaps for a relaxing dinner in one of the restaurants. One of the new restaurants, with extra pavement space in front of it, had put a few tables outside. They were for people to have a drink while they consulted the menu and waited to be shown to a proper table. Some locals weren't keen and said it obstructed the pavement, but Lucy liked it. As she was walking past, she heard a yell. It wasn't excited sounding like the previous night in the lighthouse bar. This was someone in distress. A woman was lying on the ground beside the restaurant's board, which had also fallen over. Lucy joined the group of people who'd hurried over to help, and closer up she saw it was Mr. Handsome's girlfriend. Then, looking round, she saw Mr. Handsome himself. Why wasn't he coming to help? The answer to that she then saw was that he was busy. Lucy recognized among the crowd one of the group who'd been sitting outside the restaurant. They'd all come over and, in his haste, this particular man had left his rather flash jacket hanging over the back of the chair he'd been using. And Mr. Handsome was removing from the jacket's pocket what looked to Lucy very like a wallet. Maybe she should have shouted, she would think later, but at the time she was too shocked and unsure she was correctly interpreting what she'd seen. Maybe Mr. Handsome and the man whose jacket it was were together? If so, Mr. Handsome wasn't waiting for his friend. The wallet now in his pocket, he was disappearing down one of the little lanes that led from the street to the harbor front. Moments later, the girlfriend got to her feet. She was fine, she said. Thank you, but I really am okay, she told everyone as she, too, departed down one of the lanes. Frowning, suspicions now forming in her mind, Lucy followed the girlfriend. And yes, the girlfriend and Mr. Handsome were now together on the harbor front, laughing. After a couple of minutes, while still Lucy hummed and hawed about what to do, the pair separated. Mr. Handsome went to the railings and looked down to the little beach below, then suddenly cried out as though alarmed by something he'd seen. A woman and child who were sitting on a bench just a little further along stood up and went to join him. Lucy saw the girlfriend moving towards the vacated bench, where a camera had been left, obviously about to take it. But before she could, the woman, clearly security-minded, turned back to get it and the girlfriend slunk off. I thought I saw something wrong in the sand, Mr. Handsome quickly explained to the woman, but it's all right. My mistake. No problem. He then hurried off to catch up to his girlfriend and both went into a fish and chip shop. They then came out and got into a van parked in a space opposite. For this they had keys. Lucy didn't think there was any skullduggery here. But as for the rest, so it seems to me, Lucy finished describing events to the constable at the police station, that one of them creates a diversion and then the other takes what they can. Or that's what I suspect, she added, suddenly unsure again. I hope I'm not wasting your time. I'm certain you're not, the officer assured her. He told her there had been news of a number of thefts going on all down the holiday coast. There have been clusters of them in one place over a few days, and then in another, like the culprits move on. They've got a van, Lucy explained. I didn't get the registration. I was too far away. But it was one of those you can sleep in, she added. And if they do, they must park it up somewhere for the night because they'll need facilities. Like at a campsite, the constable suggested, nodding. Yeah, and it must be near because they had their fish and chips fully wrapped. Right, the officer said, looking baffled. Like they were taking it home to eat, Lucy explained. So it must be somewhere close, or it would have got cold. The old fisherman's lookout shelter, the officer murmured. There's a campsite up there. Okay, leave this to us. Next day, the police officer, Thomas, came round to Lucy's house. We got them, he told Lucy, and everything they'd stolen. You were brilliant. Lucy didn't reply immediately, thoughts spinning in her head about ditching the idea of a career in design and becoming a detective instead. Clearly, she had the knack. Yes, a detective inspector. She could see it. Thanks from us all, Thomas spoke again, giving her a big smile that brought her back to earth and at the same time sent her heart soaring up into the sky. See you round and about, he added as he left. Yes, Lucy replied with a smile. I hope so. Story number 4. In this crime short story, set in the 1920s, when Winifred's rubies are stolen, she begins to suspect those close to her. Snatching the letter opener from her bedside table, Miss Winifred Danstanby turned on the light. There was no one there, but the silk curtains were partly open and swaying, as if in a breeze. She leaped out of bed and pulled on her dressing gown. I know you're there, she called out, and I'm armed. She swallowed, moved cautiously towards the window and flung the curtains wide. Nothing. The right-hand door was ajar, however. Taking a breath, she brandished the letter opener and made her way out onto the balcony. Still no one. From the corner of her eye she thought she saw movement at the edge of the copse. But that was all. She made her way back inside. Perhaps she had been dreaming, but she'd been sure she'd heard the creak of a floorboard and, when she'd opened her eyes, seen the outline of a shadowy figure. Deep in thought, she looked around her room. Everything seemed much as usual, except she gasped and dashed over to her dressing table. The lid of the old blue box from Boodle's was open. As she feared, the priceless ruby jewels, passed down by her grandmother, had disappeared. For a moment, she froze, her eyes widening. Then she burst out laughing. "Gracious," she exclaimed, "I've been robbed. How thrilling, and I won't have to wear those ghastly baubles ever again." What a fabulous start to the day. A few hours later, when the police had finally left, Winifred was sitting in the drawing room with her best friend, Miss Lavinia Malsington, and her two admirers, Cyril Falstrop and Redvers Delane. It was a beautiful day. Outside, the leaves of the spreading horse chestnut fluttered in a gentle breeze. "It must have been a dreadful shock for you." Redvers leaned towards her, a look of concern on his handsome face. Winifred smiled. "It was alarming for a while, but really I think the whole situation is exciting." A gleam of amusement appeared in Cyril's eyes, but Redvers shook his head. "When I think of what could have happened to you," he added. "It's simply ghastly," Lavinia said. "Are you sure that nothing else is missing? Only the hideous rubies?" "Yes," Winifred laughed. "That's the only thing. Isn't it marvelous?" "What did your grandmother say, Winnie?" Lavinia asked. A smile spread across Winifred's face and she patted her hair. "I didn't hear it all," she confessed, "but let's just say that I'm glad I am not the police inspector." Most of the household had heard Lady Danstonby when she'd explained what she would do if the inspector didn't retrieve the family heirlooms. Winifred laughed. How fabulous it was to spend the morning discussing a crime. She could tell that Lavinia and Redvers were thrilled. Lavinia's cheeks were pink and her eyes glinted. Redvers looked simply divine, as he ran a hand through his blonde hair and swore to catch the intruder. Cyril, on the other hand, was quiet. He was a nice young man, and dapper too in a dark, silent way, but Winifred was inclined to think him somewhat dull. She sighed. Lately, she seemed to attract unexciting individuals. It made her wonder where their friend Ivy was this morning. "I'm surprised you didn't bring Ivy with you, Lavinia," Winifred said. "Does she know what's happened?" Lavinia shook her head and lit a cigarette. "I thought about it, but you know how she is," she said. "I wasn't sure she could cope with crime." Winifred nodded. She hoped it wouldn't distress her. Ivy was such a mousy little creature. Winifred and Lavinia had taken her under their wing at the request of Ivy's father, Lord Booley. Her mother had passed away a year earlier, and he didn't want her to appear in society unaccompanied. "Perhaps Ivy would be good at solving crimes," Cyril suggested. "She seems an intelligent young lady." Winifred looked at Cyril in surprise. She didn't think he knew Ivy very well. Still, now he came to mention it, she was no fool. And solving crimes, what a fabulous idea. "Oh yes, let's see if we can solve the mystery," Winifred agreed. "So far, the police have found a small footprint in the flower bed and a handkerchief up by the copse, but no other leads. Who do you think could have done it?" Cyril's lips twitched, but Redvers looked horrified. "You'd better leave that to the police," he suggested. "The fellow might be dangerous." "I thought you were going to catch the bounder?" Cyril commented. Redvers glared at Cyril. "And so I shall, but the lady's safety is of paramount importance." Lavinia cleared her throat. "I think it has something to do with Mrs. Bentley Jones's amethysts. Do you recall? What a clever thought." Winifred was impressed. Mrs. Bentley Jones had undergone a very similar experience recently. During the night, her amethyst necklace had been stolen, but all else was left untouched, even her priceless diamonds. "I happen to know of another theft," Cyril said. "The victim wishes to keep the matter private, but the circumstances are much the same. I believe we have an unusual cat burglar on our hands, who is struck on at least 3 occasions." Winifred stared at Cyril. It was one of the longest speeches she'd heard him make. It was fascinating. How did he know so much about people? Maybe he wasn't quite as dull as she'd supposed. The Bonbon Club was heaving. Ivy was already seated at a table with Redvers and Cyril. The two young men, splendid in their black dinner suits and white cravats, rose to their feet as the ladies approached. "How are you today, Miss Danstonby? I do hope you're fully recovered." Redvers smiled and pulled out a chair. "Thank you. I am perfectly well," Winifred replied. "It's all enthralling." Ivy searched Winifred's face, a worried crease above her nose. "Are you sure you're not upset?" she asked. "Quite sure," Winifred replied, turning towards her. "Those rubies were ghastly, as you've heard me say a dozen times." Ivy looked relieved. "I hope all this hasn't frightened you," Winifred added. Her timid friend shook her head, and Winifred thought she saw a smile pass across her face. She was a drab little creature, with her bob that was rather too long and her brown dress. Winifred was relieved that all the intrigue hadn't given her the hysterics. She noticed Cyril watching Ivy closely. Perhaps he liked her, despite her rather antiquated appearance. After all, they were both very quiet. Maybe they would suit one another? She was surprised to feel a slight pang of regret. She had grown used to Cyril's company. He was dashing in his own way, and Redvers's flattery could be wearing. "Would you care to dance, Miss Danstonby?" Redvers held out his hand. Normally it would be a tempting offer, but she shook her head. "I believe that, tonight, Winifred would prefer sleuthing to dancing," Cyril remarked, pouring her a glass of champagne. She smiled and nodded. "Shall we order food?" Ivy blurted out. A brief silence followed her interruption. "Of course, the truffles here are divine." Lavinia clicked her fingers to summon a waiter. "So, how does one go about catching a thief?" she asked. "I've been thinking about that," Winifred replied. "It seems to me that the thief must know the victims." "Oh, what a shocking suggestion," Lavinia exclaimed. "Someone we know. What makes you think so?" "For a start, he knew exactly which window to climb to and where the jewels were kept." "Winifred's right." Cyril gave her an approving glance and her cheeks glowed. "Also," Winifred added, "he always takes the one piece of jewelry most disliked by its owner." Redvers ran a hand through his hair and cleared his throat. "Perhaps we had better change the subject," he said. "I fear the ladies may be distressed." Lavinia snorted. "We are rather enjoying ourselves, actually." Redvers mopped his brow. "I believe Miss Booley is uncomfortable," he said. "You may be right." Cyril's eyes were fixed on Ivy's face. "Perhaps you should ask her to dance." Redvers leaped up and offered his arm with alacrity. As the pair moved away, his rival chuckled. "I don't believe our friend Mr. Delane is as keen on solving mysteries as he professes," Cyril said. Winifred couldn't help but agree. Redvers was turning out to be a wet blanket. Cyril, on the other hand, she turned towards him. "Do you have any idea who it might be?" she asked. "Not yet, I'm afraid." He shook his head. "But I'm mulling over a couple of possibilities." "Darlings, I think I know." Cyril raised an eyebrow and Winifred grabbed Lavinia's hand. "Why, Mr. Ernest Falsaker," she declared. "Ernest?" "Yes," Lavinia confirmed. "He knows Mrs. Bentley Jones and your father. He's a skinny, athletic man. He could easily climb walls and fit through small spaces. He also has a quirky sense of humor." Winifred clapped. "Livy, you're brilliant," she told her friend. "Perhaps we should warn the police," Lavinia said. "I'm afraid I wouldn't," Cyril replied. "Whilst everything you say about Mr. Falsaker is true, he has very large feet." Silence greeted this pronouncement. Then Winifred nodded. "Of course, the footprint in the flower bed." She raised her eyes to Cyril's face. Clever and handsome, he was becoming more interesting by the minute. Winifred had finished her breakfast and sat sipping her cup of tea. It was a beautiful morning. The light mist had cleared, and a mellow sun set dewdrops sparkling across the lawn. Geraniums blazed in tall urns on either side of the stone steps. She was wondering for the umpteenth time which member of her acquaintance might be a thief, when the door opened and Hoskins entered. He cleared his throat. "You have a visitor, miss," he announced. Winifred looked up, startled. It was very early in the day. "Mr. Cyril Falstrop," She had barely collected herself when the man in question entered the room and bowed. He wore a light suit, trench coat, and trilby. His dark hair was neatly groomed and his eyes sparkled. She swallowed and wondered what he was doing here. "I'm sorry to intrude on your breakfast, Miss Danstonby," he began, "but I was rather hoping that you might like to solve our little mystery today." She felt a shiver of excitement and clapped her hands. "What a fabulous idea, Cyril. Do you have any leads?" she asked. He smiled, and she thought how strikingly handsome he was. She wondered why she hadn't noticed before. He was at least as dashing as Redvers. "I think we might do best to follow the evidence," Cyril reasoned. "Shall we start with the footprint?" "Oh yes," Winifred agreed. "I'll get my coat." A short while later, Winifred left the house with Cyril and made her way round to a flower bed not far from her bedroom window. "It should be here somewhere," she told him. "At least the inspector said so." She cast a furtive glance Cyril's way. He looked animated and she smiled. What fun this was. It seemed that it was going to be a super day. "Here it is." Cyril held back the leaves of an azalea bush. Winifred saw a faint imprint in the soil. "How clever you are, but goodness, it is terribly small," Winifred commented. "Indeed it is." Winifred stared at the print. Cyril had been right. There was no way this could belong to Mr. Falsaker. A lot of men had bigger feet than this. Of course, some didn't. Redvers, for one. She used to think his small feet elegant, but as she glanced at Cyril's larger two-tone shoes, she changed her mind. "Well, that's our first clue," he said. "I believe you told the police that you saw movement by the cops, and that's where they found the handkerchief. Shall we head up there next?" "Oh yes. I wonder what we will find," Winifred mused. Cyril offered his arm, and they made their way together towards the trees at the far side of the lawn. "I've been racking my brain," she said, "but it's so hard to imagine anyone we know as a cat burglar. People aren't always what they seem." Cyril raised an eyebrow. "I suppose not." Winifred thought about Redvers. He hadn't turned out to be half as dashing as she'd imagined. Then she remembered his small feet, and a sudden idea struck her. "Gracious," she said. "You don't think Redvers could be our man, do you? His feet are tiny." Cyril laughed. "I have considered the possibility," he confessed. "He doesn't seem keen on our detective work, either. He always tries hard to change the subject." "That's true." Winifred's eyes gleamed, but then she shook her head. "I'm not sure he has the courage to be a thief." That made Cyril laugh louder. "I think you may be right," he said, "but let's defer judgment until we have more evidence." By this time, they had reached the edge of the copse and Winifred's excitement mounted. "I'll go over here," she told Cyril. "You go that way." "Right you are." He saluted and headed off. Winifred stood and thought for a moment. Where exactly had she seen movement that night? She wandered to her right and began to examine the tree trunks at the edge of the copse. She hadn't gone far when her sharp eyes spotted something. "Quick, Cyril, over here," she called. He was by her side in a moment. "What is it?" he asked. "A bit of lace, I believe." She reached out and removed it from a low branch. "You're right. It must have come from the handkerchief." "Marvelous work, Winifred." She blushed and clapped her hands. "A lace handkerchief. That explains the footprint size," she exclaimed, her eyes blazing. "The thief is a lady. Gracious. Who do we know that is acquainted with myself? Mrs. Bentley Jones and Lady Treshaw?" Cyril wheeled round and stared at her. "How did you know that Lady Treshaw is the third victim?" he asked. "She was keeping it a secret." Winifred's mouth fell open. "Why, Ivy mentioned it," she replied. "She knew there were 3 victims all along, though she wasn't there when you told us. She referred to 3 crimes at the club. How did she know that there was another theft and who the victim was?" Later that evening, Winifred, Cyril, and Lavinia were sharing a pre-dinner drink. "I still can't believe it, darlings." Lavinia sipped her mimosa and looked from one to the other. "Are you absolutely certain? I mean, Ivy. She's so, well, dull." "Apparently not." Winifred laughed. "But what possible reason could she have?" Lavinia asked. "Despite her family's wealth, it was money, I believe. The police had arrested Ivy earlier that afternoon." It seemed that her father, Lord Bugley, kept her on a tight leash, and her mother's death had made things worse. She had been subjected to a year of strict mourning and emerged from it with a tiny allowance. On her return to society, grief-stricken and miserable, she had grown increasingly jealous of the other girls' beautiful clothes and trinkets. "What will happen to her now, darlings?" Lavinia asked. "I've no idea," Winifred said. "Poor Ivy. There will have to be a court case and a dreadful scandal," despite her promise to return all the jewels. "Yes," Cyril agreed, "though I don't believe their owners will want them back." "Quite," Winifred groaned. "I shall have to wear those frightful rubies again." "Never mind, darling. But I still can't believe it. People aren't always what they seem, are they, Cyril?" Winifred batted her eyelashes and Cyril kissed her hand. Yes, Winifred reflected. Ivy certainly wasn't the quiet young lady they had taken her for. Redvers was by no means so dashing. And Cyril? Best of all, he had turned out to be far from dull. In fact, when he'd taken her in his arms, she'd melted into them. And when he'd suggested that they solved mysteries together for the rest of their lives, what could she do but agree? Story number 5. Sam hoped she could count on Dominic when the chips were down. "I am so sorry," Eve said. "I'll never live this down." Dominic shook his head. "Eve, this was as much my dumb mistake as it was yours. I am going to look on it as something to tell my grandchildren." "Me too," she nodded. "Once I get over the embarrassment, thousands of people have done the same thing. It's the Las Vegas effect. Dominic, you live in Las Vegas. You ought to be immune. It's a strong effect." There was a silence. They were standing on the pavement in front of the Rose Rhinestone Hotel, sheltering from a Nevada sun under its long awning. Eve had called Dominic out on to what she hoped was neutral territory for their little chat. Dominic leaned back against the outside wall of the hotel and Eve copied him, so that they were facing the street in tandem. A silver limo cruised past. Eve had not recovered yet from the night before, with its overindulgence in Mexican food and tequila, and it seemed that Dominic was in a similar condition. "I get an ache in my lower back if I don't get enough sleep," he mused. "Me too," Eve replied. "Back home I use ice. Those squashy cushions you freeze in the freezer?" "In the freezer, yes." Despite it all, she giggled. There was another silence. "So now I know how to get married in Las Vegas," Eve continued. "Do you know how I can get divorced?" Dominic opened his mouth to say something, but then they were interrupted. Out of the hotel entrance poured 5 noisy young Scottish women headed up by Louise, the bride. Bringing up the rear were Louise's mum and stepmom. "Breakfast time," Louise yelled. It was 11 o'clock, but nobody had been awake for long. They noticed Eve and all stopped. A look of delight spread across the face of Casey, one of the hens. My girls," Casey exclaimed. Eve was doubtful about coming to Las Vegas, but she's made up for it now. Eve shook her head, but the girls took no notice. They launched into catcalls and whooping noises. The truth was, though, that Eve had left Dominic at 1 o'clock in the morning as the enormity of what had just occurred in the Ivory Vale wedding chapel hit her. All she could remember was a wave of regret. Dominic had not tried to stop her leaving. He had been happy to accept her excuse, something about needing to phone her mum. Then he had mumbled something about a shift at the hotel and had hurried off along the street. There had been no blissful romance, but they were married. Eve didn't say anything to the hen party. She would have to start the process of a divorce as the trip went on and hope the girls would forget in the onslaught of roulette and burgers. Never had she regretted an evening more. It was so out of character. Eve was the sensible one in the office. She knew everybody's birthdays and kept the sugar bowl topped up. Maybe Dominic the bartender was more the spontaneous type. She looked hard at Dominic. At least she knew his surname now, Riley. She had signed her own surname next to it last night as they stood laughing under a chiffon canopy in front of an officiant dressed in white. Until then, she'd barely been able to recall his first name. He had just been a beautiful, kind, hilarious man who seemed willing to give her a bit of a boost. He had joined in the fun and made her feel that life could be a blast and that she could be at the center of something. It was just that now she was married to a man she didn't know. "Will you get back to me about that?" she asked him. Dominic looked blank, but it was too late to say more because the hens were sweeping her up and he was hurrying indoors for work. Blackjack, Louise cried. Ever played it? Tara asked. Louise laughed. Never. Do you have to add up? Louise's elegant stepmom, 39-year-old Irina, smiled. I'll help you, darling, she said in her Russian accent. Eve knew she had to play. There was no way she could avoid the planned activities without looking like a grump. Anyway, Louise deserved to have a good time. Person only got married once. Well, most people do. David Fenster, Louise's 60-year-old father, had notably got married twice. First time to Louise's mum Sandra, then to Irina. Louise and Irina were close, and Eve sometimes wondered how that went down with Sandra. Sandra was 62 and a quiet, sensible woman with a career as an academic. They piled into the hotel's casino. It wasn't busy. Even hardened gamblers didn't all start before lunch. A small, thin man in a trilby sat at what Eve assumed was a blackjack table. He looked faintly annoyed as Louise loudly positioned her friends and relatives around him. Mom, you'll play, won't you? She asked. Not me, darling, Sandra replied with a smile. Louise took the hand of Ella, a pretty woman that Eve had heard about at work but never met. Ella managed to look nice in the preposterous pink and silver outfits that Louise had made them all put on for the day. Come on, Elle, Louise exclaimed. Play. Ella was the most softly spoken of the group. She was a friend of Louise's from a previous job. Tara had told Eve on the plane that Ella had dated Callum, the groom, for some time before Louise came on the scene. For maybe 6 months, Tara explained. I think Ella is a bit sorer about it than she makes out. She's been single since, and it makes you wonder. Ella didn't want to gamble, but Irina was more amenable. Delighted, Louise squeezed her in beside the small man, who shifted uncomfortably on his stool. It was an incongruous sight. The little middle-aged man was bent over the table in a checked shirt, shifting chips from hand to hand. Beside him was beautiful Irina with her blonde plaits and ivory silk shirt, examining the table gravely. The croupier took another hen party in her stride. Periodically, she checked the one man at the table to make sure he was at ease. He didn't look at ease to Eve. She saw him peer at Irina, his eyes narrowed, as though she was in his space and he didn't like it one bit. Irina knew how to play. As she gathered a pile of chips, Eve gave her an inquiring look. I once worked in a place like this, she said quietly, her voice masked by all the noise Louise, Tara, Casey, and Imogen were making. I had a lot of jobs. Irina won, not with a fanfare, but gradually, until everyone at the table was watching her. That's me done, she said with a laugh after playing for an hour. Nice work, Sandra told her. Irina turned to the man. Eve could tell he had used up everything he'd brought to the table. I am sorry you were disturbed, she said with a polite smile. She was icily but strikingly lovely. I don't imagine a hen weekend is what you want when you're trying to enjoy a quiet game. Whatever, he replied. He gave her a long look and then he was gone, slipping between the tables. The croupier collected chips. Mr. Leonard is a regular here, she informed them. Imogen clapped. Who's for milkshakes? It's on the schedule. When Eve turned to leave the table, she thought she saw Mr. Leonard standing near a doorway. But then she decided it could have been a shadow. As they set off, they passed a store selling the kind of jewelry that looked perfectly normal in Vegas, but Eve thought would look brashly out of place in Shawlands or Scottsdale. I could get a souvenir, Louise mused. Irina. Mom. Look at these bracelets. Both women stepped forward. They were not chummy with each other, Eve had noticed, but they were polite. If you really want one, Sandra said. Irina looked doubtful. That's a lot of dollars. Louise's dad, David, did something with paper. Eve wasn't clear exactly what, but he was a creative. Louise had once shown them some packaging for classy art gallery souvenirs that he had designed. It obviously brought him and Irina a decent living, but he was never referred to as a rich man. David clearly adored his only child, and Eve guessed he had gone along with her desire to go to Vegas. Eve had made the trip reluctantly. The cost was terrifyingly high, and she didn't feel she was that close to Louise. They shared a desk and chatted in their breaks. But the hen party invitation had been a surprise. Just getting there had used up all Eve's annual holiday budget. But she didn't have any plans, so she had said yes. And now she had gone and got herself a husband, which was as idiotic a thing to do as she could think of. Louise was steered gently away from the jewelry store, and they went on their way for milkshakes. Eve felt sick as they set off back to the hotel. Dominic seemed a nice guy, and she felt awful for this error of judgment. But then he'd made the same mistake. The women dispersed to rest in their rooms. Eve took the stairs, and as she paused on the second-floor gallery, she looked down at the glitzy foyer. There was Irina near the street doors, looking into a glass cabinet filled with hotel merchandise. Another figure approached. It was a long way to the ground, but Eve was fairly certain it was Mr. Leonard from the casino. She saw Irina turn and Mr. Leonard engage her in conversation. Irina backed away twice until her back was pressed against the cabinet. Eve could not make out if there was a problem, but when Irina ducked out of the man's way and walked off, she supposed their exchange was over. It might, she thought, have been an attempt to chat up Irina. She carried on upstairs. For the next 2.5 hours, she enjoyed a blissful nap. She was woken by the sound of thundering feet in the corridor and shrieking. Blinking, she opened her door and saw members of the hen party in groups, dotted along the passage. Sandra came to Eve's door. She was shaking. "It's Irina," she said. "What about her?" Sandra was struggling to speak. She fell. "Eve. She's on the poolside." It was like a nightmare. Irina's body had been found splayed out on the concrete, dead instantly. Their rooms were 3 floors up, and there was no way she could have survived such a fall. All the women gathered in a small lounge off the casino floor while police carried out an initial investigation. Some of them stared at the ceiling. Some chattered and speculated until Eve wanted to slap them. Why would she do that? Tara whimpered. "She wouldn't," Sandra snapped. "She was happy." Eve wondered if she heard bitterness in Sandra's voice, but put it down to stress. Louise cried and said she had to call her father, and a police officer escorted her to perform that miserable task. David would be brought to Las Vegas to deal with the death of his wife. Then, 2 hours later, when Louise had returned in an even worse state than before, the detective in charge entered the room. "We have a great deal to do," he said in a sober voice, "and it might save time and distress to let you all know this at once. Mrs. Fenster's death was not an accident. We can be sure of that." 7 tear-stained faces gaped at him. "There is strong evidence of a scuffle on the balcony of room 307, and it is recent evidence. My team and I sure that Mrs. Fenster was." He hesitated. "A second person was in the room, and that person propelled her over the balustrade. Footprints indicate that scenario along with disturbance in the room. But we have more work to do." The police wanted information about the victim. Louise had the closest relationship to Irina but was in too much of a state to provide it. Sandra explained her relationship to the dead woman, and the police felt she wasn't a good source. Eve could see the detective, a tall guy with a piercingly intelligent gaze, making mental notes. He was clocking the 2 wives and the potential for rivalry. Casey said that Eve was the least emotional of them, so Eve told Detective Shaw that she knew a reasonable amount about the family, having worked with Louise for some time. "You're Miss Dexter?" Detective Shaw asked. He gave her an intense look. "I'll start with you." Eve sighed. "Where shall I go?" she asked. They talked in the office behind the reception area. Eve told Detective Shaw that Irina was from Ukraine and had come to the UK as an au pair. David had met her at a work function at some large house in Glasgow. He had been at the end of his marriage to Sandra at the time. Detective Shaw gently inquired about the relationship between the 2 wives, and Eve said, truthfully, that she didn't know. "Thank you, Miss Dexter," he said. "I'll let you get back. We will be asking the whole party to stay in the hotel, by the way, but you can use the facilities." He gave a faint smile. "Perhaps not the pool." Eve made for the door. "Have you any other comment? Any ideas about who might have had a problem with the second Mrs. Fenster?" he asked. "No," Eve replied. "Except this is probably nothing." Awkwardly, Eve described the blackjack table, Mr. Leonard's intense irritation, Irina's success at his expense, and then what she had seen in the foyer. Everyone gave a statement, and it became obvious that any of them could have knocked and entered at Irina's door. In fact, any hotel guest or member of staff quite possibly could have. Later, sitting together over a desultory supper in the restaurant, they shared their versions. Most of them had been fast asleep. "I wish I'd taken the champagne in," Louise wailed. The discussion had set her off again. "I wish I'd woken and remembered." "What champagne?" Sandra asked. "I brought a bottle to share with Irina. She loves champagne. She never got a drop in Ukraine." Irina was known to have come from relative poverty. "I can't believe this," Louise cried. She grasped Sandra's hand. "She was like my second mother." Eve wasn't sure that mother was quite the right word. Irina was only 14 years older than her stepdaughter, but Sandra put an arm tightly around her child. "I want Daddy," Louise sobbed. Sandra closed her eyes for a moment. "He is going to be in a terrible state," she said. "Poor David." Eve thought at first that Detective Shaw was going to solve the case at top speed. He seemed to have all the skills and a great team behind him. But things stalled the next morning. "It's the international problem," he told Eve. "The protocols are complex. They take time when a foreign national has died on our soil." "What a pain," she replied, and he chuckled. "Every murder case is a pain," he told her. In all the misery, Eve had forgotten Dominic and their regrettable wedding. It seemed irreverent even to think of it, but she had to do something. At least her husband worked at the hotel and would be nearby. Dominic Riley made cocktails at the bar of the Rose Rhinestone Hotel. He was extremely good at it, which had been a small part of the problem the night before. The hen party's evening had begun at the hotel. When Dominic's shift ended at 9:30, he had accompanied them round a city he knew well. He was exceedingly handsome, with a freckled face that made people smile when he smiled. Eve realized now that she had been a sitting duck for just this sort of faux pas. She had arrived in Las Vegas irritable about how much she'd spent and feeling overlooked. She had felt that the hen party could just as well have been held back in Glasgow at a nice restaurant, with some silly gifts and a drive along Sauchiehall Street in a stretch limo. With her bank account empty and the other girls behaving like idiots, Eve had been grumpy and then attention-seeking. Chatting up Dominic had seemed a feeble revenge on. She wasn't sure who. Something in her had longed for the triumph of it, the little flood of the limelight. But, Eve thought as she made her way to the staff quarters of the hotel, it took two to tango. Both of them had been utter fools, showing off like 6-year-olds, dashing off to a wedding chapel as though they wanted nothing more than to become a giant cliché. "I blame the state of Nevada for charging less than $100 for a marriage license," Dominic declared. She'd found him in the staff room, searching on his mobile phone. "They should make it 1,000, Eve returned. 10,000. They laughed, and that helped to break the ice. The only requirements at the wedding chapel had been one form of ID. Eve couldn't even remember now which she'd produced, possibly her driving license. Then she recalled that Dominic had snatched it. "You are a lot better looking in real life, Eve Dexter," he'd remarked. The whole thing had been appalling. "If they'd asked me for a blood test," Dominic began. "That might have stopped me in my tracks," she interrupted. "I'm afraid of needles." "Me too," he nodded. "Ever since I was a kid." They were both avoiding talk of Irina's death. She reflected that when she did get married, sometime in the distant future, she'd try to find some fella like Dominic Riley, but with a better salary and not American. Really, Nevada's laws had to be reformed. If two idiots could fill in a form, hand over $60 cash and photo ID and get a license within minutes, there was something seriously wrong. Dominic held up his phone to show her that had made some headway with arranging a divorce. He texted her the details of a cheap lawyer they could share. "Thanks," she said. "I won't be bothering you for much longer." "It's no bother," he replied in his rather adorable accent. "Is it, going okay? We don't get many deaths in the hotel." He said it so nicely that it didn't seem crass, so Eve chatted to him about Irina. It was a relief. The hen party weren't great at civilized discussion. She described Mr. Leonard, and Dominic said he knew the guy. "I've always thought him harmless," he said, "but I only know him as propping up my bar. If he was trying to hit on Irina, that might be a different matter." He might have been humiliated both by a trouncing at blackjack and a rejection of his advances. I think it's in Detective Shaw's mind, Eve answered. Leonard's a terrible tipper, Dominic added. I'm guessing he hates to lose his cash. A misogynist might hate losing to a woman, too, and be angrier when she won't respond to him. There was something else going round in Eve's head. There's been endless talk among the girls, she began. Tara told me that Ella— Do I know who Ella is? He interrupted to ask. Short, attractive, brunette, as opposed to taller, very attractive, brunette? Eve flushed. Focus, Dominic, she told him. It's confusing when you pay compliments to a woman you're divorcing. He laughed. Ella used to date Louise's fiancé, Callum, Eve explained. So there's seething jealousy underneath? Dominic asked. But wouldn't that bring Ella to the point of throwing Louise off a balcony? Why Irina? I shouldn't be thinking any of this. But Tara claims that Irina brokered the hookup between Louise and Callum. Eve told him. Irina had quite an influence over Louise, she went on. She encouraged them to see each other. I guess a grudge from Ella against Irina might be stronger, because Irina had a position of power. That's the psychology I'm thinking of. Eve nodded. You have to tell Shaw. As the next few days of the investigation passed, David Fenster flew in. He moved around the hotel in a daze and sometimes huddled with his ex-wife. Eve had to show up to meetings with the lawyer, then sign a statement. She was relieved to have her divorce to distract her. It was no less embarrassing than before, especially now an attorney was involved, but it was something to do. Dominic made her laugh, and laughing helped. They had things in common and not just their weakness for spur-of-the-moment weddings. Eve sat up late in the bar and they talked. Let's see. We've got creepy Mr. Leonard in the frame, Dominic began. He's not been here since. I guess the police have been interviewing him. Detective Shaw says his alibi is shaky, Eve explained. Leonard says he spent the afternoon and evening in another casino, but can't remember which one. Dominic shrugged. They can be a bit sammy, and there are lots of them. Plus, we have your friend Ella in a jealous rage. She's not my friend, Eve reminded him, and she seems too mild-mannered to be a killer. Killers are often mild, my dear. But why did she come if she hates Irina? She asked. To throw her to her death on concrete. Wouldn't you favor a moment when a bunch of suspects were around? Dominic replied. I suppose I would. He looked at her with a grin. You have such a funny accent. It's Glaswegian. Don't be rude. Glaswegian is such a cool word. I like the accent, actually, Dominic replied. What about the wife? The first wife, I mean, Sandra. Did she resent Irina? He thought about it. That's unclear. I've heard her say a couple of sharp things, but she's pretty civilized. And she and David split up some time ago. On the other hand, being usurped by a beauty like Irina might be tough. Dominic nodded. Sandra is the obvious suspect, and it's often the most obvious person who's committed the crime. Who else? Another of the hens? But who? They're an uninteresting lot. All except you. Was it you, Eve? Eve gave him a look, saying that could mark the end of this beautiful friendship. What friendship? He asked. She laughed quickly. Marriage, then. The end of this marriage. It's nearly over anyway. Eve didn't know what to say. She fiddled with the dishes of olives on the bar. Okay, Dominic said. So did the bride do the deed? Louise hasn't got the character to be a murderer, and she thought the sun shone out of Irina, Eve replied. What about a financial motive? Dominic looked pleased with himself. I've come across this before. The child of a broken marriage realizes that all the dough will go to the new wife if Pop dies. So the child poisons wife number 2 to keep the dough in the family. Eve shook her head. There's not much dough. He's a good designer, I think, but I haven't seen his name around the place. That's no motive. Dominic looked disappointed. I'm out of theories. We're sure that Irina didn't chuck herself off that balcony? Eve shook her head. Not according to Detective Shaw, and he's my hero. Have you seen him? He oozes reassurance. Maybe, when you've divorced me, you could take Detective Shaw to the Ivory Vale wedding chapel. He's already married. Otherwise, I would. Eve laughed. Dominic's phone pinged and he tapped it. We're one stop nearer to being divorcees, he he told her. Oh, Eve imagined the lawyer's email: clear, efficient, time-saving. That's good. We could keep in touch, Dominic suggested. But not if you don't want. No, that'd be okay, she interrupted. Like pen pals? I guess. He rubbed his eyes. When you say that Detective Shaw is solving the case, is he? It takes time, Eve reasoned. If they charge Leonard, we can go home. I'll be off for a sleep now, Eve added. Not many more sleeps until we say goodbye to our embarrassing mistake. Great, she said, without much enthusiasm. It had been a long day. Louise's father announced that he would take Louise home with him. Their plan was to delay the wedding until the grief had abated a little. Father and daughter made an odd contrast, Eve thought. She had never met David before, and he was a sober, quiet person. Louise was responding to the trauma by talking a lot. She was also shopping now that Detective Shaw had allowed them out of the hotel. It's a reaction, she told Eve, who had taken her a cup of tea one morning. On the coffee table in her room was a row of bags with designer names. Stuff makes me feel better, Louise explained. I bought investment pieces, though, and the exchange rate is good. Eve smiled. You don't need to justify yourself to me, she said. They will find who killed Irina, won't they? Louise asked, wanting Eve's reassurance. Are the Las Vegas police good, do you think? I think so, Eve assured her. Don't use your energy worrying about that. Eve met Detective Shaw in the third-floor corridor later that day. He was sending away what looked like a forensics officer. It took the guys a while to study the floor and balcony marks, he explained. He was gazing through the door into Irina's room. They wanted to be sure. It was all female shoes. As in small shoes? Eve asked. As in shoes with heels, and narrow heels at that. Eve thought of the women tottering along the Las Vegas streets. Louise and Imogen had put together outfits for the trip, and that day, the day of milkshakes and gambling and death, most of them had worn kitten heels. Detective Shaw shifted his gaze to Eve's feet. She was wearing sandals, the sort she always wore in hot weather, with flat soles and laces up her ankles. I'm not a heels wearer, she said. I broke a metatarsal as a teenager and heels hurt me. You can take a look at the ones they gave me. They're still in the box. The detective smiled. He thought about the shoes. Even Sandra had been given a version of the pink and silver outfit that day. Eve recalled her cursing the heels. Ella, too, though unwilling to join in with some things, had worn hers. Detective Shaw tapped his notebook with his pen. But a man can wear heels. If I was Leonard, I might do that to throw us off the scent. You're good, Detective. Don't say that until we get a result, the officer warned. I have to go more into motive. Eve had already told him what she and Dominic had talked about. Ella's possible anger with Irina and Sandra's possible hidden resentment. It all seemed disloyal and speculative. That fleshes out a few things, he said, and I've taken a lot of information from Mr. Fenster, too. His wife was from Ukraine. Yes, she'd not been in Scotland that long when she met him. He said she had very little back in the home country. I wonder how that impacts our story. Eve didn't understand how it could. Irina was dead. So her own motives were unimportant. This Dominic, Detective Shaw began. He was working, in full view of the whole hotel. When Irina died, Eve replied. Shaw grinned. I know. I've got a full picture of the staff. It's just that you and he seem nothing, she interrupted again. The night before was a crazy evening. With too much tequila. You got married? Didn't you? Eve was startled and Detective Shaw laughed. I've seen it before, he said. It's always hilarious. I did meet a couple once who stayed married, he went on. As far as I know, they still are. That won't be happening here, Detective Shaw, Eve assured him. If you say so, he replied. Eve and Dominic took a walk into some of the quieter areas of Vegas. Eve mulled over Irina's personality. She was careful with money, she commented. Detective Shaw was interested in that. Dominic put on his wise face. He had a lot of faces, and this one she loved. Money comes into most murders, he said. And how do you know? I read a lot. He stopped walking. They had reached the end of a raised sidewalk, and he jumped down and then put out a hand for Eve. She stumbled on landing and found herself an inch from him. Sorry, they said together. and for a moment they were just looking at one another, before he sidestepped. I think I've read every Agatha Christie, he went on. My guilty pleasure. They're pretty good books, she agreed. She had also read them all, but it seemed that to tell him would open some door, expose her to some risk that she could not articulate. They walked on in the shade of a row of trees. I got a message just before meeting you, he said casually. We are officially no longer married. You are no longer Mrs. Riley. Eve felt lightheaded. It had been much quicker than she'd imagined. A quick appointment in a cheap attorney's office, papers to sign, that had felt like just the start. The breeze dropped unexpectedly, and Eve felt strange, suspended in a moment and unwilling to leave it. Hey, pen pal, he said. Will you be in the bar later? I've nowhere else to go, Eve replied. Sandra was sitting at the bar when Eve entered that evening. She was nursing an orange juice and fiddling with her phone. Sandra smiled as Eve approached. The sane one of the girls, she said. Hi. Eve looked at Sandra, trying to imagine this plain-spoken, intelligent woman shoving Irina over a balustrade. It seemed unlikely. She took the stool next to Sandra's and ordered a soda water from Dominic. He looked so good under the golden lights of the bar, she thought, absorbed in his work. She could reach out and touch him if she wanted to, but also she could not. I am worried about David, Sandra admitted. Has he been allowed to book a flight home? Eve asked. Yes, with Louise, though I think that detective expected to be able to tell them both more before letting them go. How is David? Numb, I think. He wanders about. He's not a demonstrative person and he hides his feelings. I always thought that he married Irina because she was the kind of person to guide him and tell him what to do. She placed her glass carefully on the bar. He made a good choice. Dominic was giving Eve a look. When Sandra left the room to go to the ladies, Eve noticed her phone. Its case flipped open and a column of messages visible. She realized that Dominic had seen it, too. Shaw would want to know about Sandra's state of mind, he said. He's still waiting for the go-ahead to examine our phones, Eve agreed. It's unacceptable, Dominic said, but his eye kept straying to the message feed. Eve saw two words, good woman, and, glancing round to check the room, she decided to read just one message. Dominic moved along behind the bar towards her, pretending to clear away some bar mats. The message was to Sandra, not from her. Yes, Sandy, honey, she was a good woman. You've always been magnanimous about Irina, and that should make you feel less terrible about this tragedy. Eve gave up her pretense. She read quickly and found kind messages from friends and replies from Sandra. She saw positive comments about Irina and support for David. I wanted him happy, Sandra wrote. This is a catastrophe for D. Eve tapped the phone to wake up the screen and spun it round so Dominic could see. A glass cloth hanging from his arm, he read at speed, then looked at Eve. Either she's brilliant at hoaxing or she didn't want to kill Irina, he said. He flung the cloth over his shoulder. She's coming back. Eve tried to keep the rest of the hen party amused with her divorce. They laughed a bit, but lacked the energy for more. Ella especially was low. That evening Eve knocked on Ella's door and asked her if she was okay. I just want to go home, Ella admitted. This is horrible. I don't suppose it will be long now, Eve replied. A tablet computer buzzed and Ella leaned over to touch its screen. Oh, she exclaimed, and she glanced at Eve, her expression awkward. Her focus moved from Eve to the screen and back. Hi, Tom, she said quickly. Eve had never heard of Tom. She remembered Tara's words on the plane. Ella had been steadfastly single since Irina and Louise had stolen Callum. Ella was more resentful than she liked to make out. Tom was a good-looking man with a tidy beard. He was sitting near his screen with a soppy grin. Hi, gorgeous, he replied. Eve knew she was not visible to him. I miss you so much that I can't work, Tom went on. Ella gave him a look of yearning. I see talk just now. I will call you back, she said. She shut down the tablet. We're in love, Ella said. For how long? I met him soon after Callum. That's a long time ago. Eve was surprised. I was cross when Callum was practically swiped from under my nose, but I met Tom pretty quickly after that. And you didn't mention him because you wanted Louise to feel bad? Ella hung her head. I know, you don't have to tell me it was childish. Actually, it was Irina I was more miffed with. But Irina was just responding to Louise and trying to make her happy. Ella drew the back of her hand across her forehead. I liked Irina, really. The way she supported Louise, who can be flaky and selfish sometimes. She sighed. I mustn't be horrid about poor Louise. Eve was popping with her news and just had to tell Dominic. He was in the bar wiping tables. It wasn't Ella, she said. And it wasn't Sandra, as far as we can tell. We're running out of suspects, Dominic replied. What about Leonard? Detective Shaw appeared in the doorway to the foyer. You read my thoughts, the detective said. He has an alibi. I might have to close this case with no result. Eve shared her findings about both Sandra and Ella, and Shaw nodded. Where was Leonard at the time? Dominic asked. Playing roulette, the detective replied. We did a sweep of security staff at all the casinos. A guy at a middle-sized place out towards Spring Valley got back to me with a report of a man matching Leonard's description. Annoying female customers. I've been sent CCTV clips and it checks out. Leonard was not on the third floor of this hotel at the time Mrs. Fenster died. The case was beginning to look unsolvable. Detective Shaw was about to let them all disperse, so he was probably admitting defeat. It also reminded Eve that she, too, was about to leave Las Vegas. No more laughs with Dominic. No more jokes about marriage. No more walks. This was good news. It had been a dreadful time. So why did she feel as though the air had been let out of her? Dominic was in a bad mood on the morning of the Fensters' departure. He'd been given the early bar shift and was keeping his distance from Eve as he stabbed cherries with cocktail sticks. A head appeared at the door to the foyer. It was a man with wisps of gray hair on a nearly bald head and a shy expression. Sorry, the man said. There seems to be nobody on reception. Dominic rolled his eyes. That's Gina, he said. She's forever taking a break. Sorry, the man said again. May I come in? Of course, sir, Dominic said, recovering his professional demeanor. If you take a seat, I'll call to Trace, our receptionist. His name was Mr. Perslake. He had come from Edinburgh via Heathrow and Dallas. He ordered a cup of tea and perched on a stool. Dominic tried the staff room on the internal phone. Gina says she's coming back soon, he told them, but that can mean 20 minutes. That's quite all right, Mr. Perslake said. I don't want to be a bother. Are you staying? Eve asked after a while. He seemed an odd guest for a glitzy Vegas casino hotel. I found a motel nearby. I came to pay my respects, he said. This is an unusual move for me. But Mrs. Fenster was a valued client and a wonderful woman. Client? Dominic prompted. Mr. Perslake grimaced. I am their accountant. I'm sure Mr. Fenster will appreciate your visit, Eve said, surprised. He's due to go home soon, though. Perhaps I should have waited for his return to Scotland. But I was so agitated. I barely know Mr. Fenster. But you managed his affairs? Eve asked. Yes, but Irina took all financial affairs from her husband's shoulders some time ago. She was so concerned with accuracy and so efficient. Mr. Fenster was the creative force and both his wives were managers. Mrs. Sandra Fenster oversaw only the beginnings of her husband's success. He was a late bloomer, Mr. Perslake explained. During the first marriage, he began to be appreciated in specialist circles. During the second, he blossomed, he added. Eve tried to work out why the accountant had come all this way to commiserate with a client. Clearly, Irina had had a powerful effect on him. They heard Gina stomping back behind the reception desk and then Louise's voice greeting her. Dominic says there's a Mr. Perslake here for the family, Gina told her in her bored voice. Louise came hurrying in to the bar. My dear Miss Fenster, I want to, Mr. Perslake began. But Louise was upon him before he could finish the sentence. Smiling, she took his elbow and swept him towards the foyer. It's terribly kind of you to come, she was saying. I couldn't believe it when the girl said your name. Mr. Perslake twisted his body to look back at Eve and Dominic. He was confused at the hurry. If I could see Mr. Fenster for a moment, he said. He's delicate, Louise replied, terribly upset. Let me help you. Eve watched them vanish through the open doorway. I haven't seen Louise that animated since Irina died, she said. She must be feeling better. Let's hope so, Dominic replied, but he was gazing thoughtfully after the pair. Mr. Perslake spent little time at the hotel. Less than half an hour later they saw Louise in the foyer asking Gina to call him a cab. Eve could see Mr. Perslake standing beside Louise, looking muddled. The cab would be 15 minutes, Gina told him. I'll wait with you, Louise said. She looked up at a giant clock on the wall. I can cancel a pedicure, probably. Mr. Perslake's pale eyes blinked repeatedly. Goodness, don't wait on my account. If Mr. Fenster is unable to see me, do you mind terribly if I nip off? Then, Louise asked. And thank you again. Louise headed out into the street and he was alone. 10 minutes after that, Gina called out, cabs caught in traffic. Dominic strode out to the lobby with Eve in pursuit. Dominic had a very determined air about him, and he firmly suggested that the accountant wait in the more pleasant atmosphere of the bar. I am going to make you our specialty cocktail, Dominic offered. It's on the house. Moments later he slid a tall glass towards Mr. Perslake. I don't drink much, Mr. Perslake said. It's almost all mango juice, Dominic explained. He had made it specially for the accountant. He was such a lovely guy, Eve thought. Mr. Perslake sipped and relaxed a little. It's just, the accountant began. Who will manage the investments now? Is there much work involved in that? Eve asked. She didn't even have a savings account. There are decisions to be made, Mr. Perslake replied. With such a sizable pot, that can be an undertaking. Eve spoke carefully. I thought the Fensters were of modest means, Mr. Perslake. Not that it's any of my business. Dominic had his eyes fixed on the man. You haven't had a chance to talk to Mr. Fenster yet? He's delicate, Mr. Perslake echoed Louise's words. I don't want to assume. I can go home and see him when he gets back. I think I'll ask Gina to give David a quick call in his room, Dominic said. David Fenster entered the room 5 minutes later. He frowned at Mr. Perslake, recognizing him but obviously confused. I'm sorry, he said. I'm not in my best state of mind. I am Ian Perslake of Perslake, Mentieth and Smith. We have only met on a few occasions, Mr. Fenster. You engaged me when you first began freelance work to complete your accounts, but very quickly the first Mrs. Fenster took over the correspondence. He coughed. And following that, the second Mrs. Fenster took the reins. Yes, of course. I'm sorry. David's brow furrowed. I did leave it all to Irina, the money side. The design business ticked along, as you know. Mr. Perslake's eyebrows rose and then fell. Perhaps your wife liked that turn of phrase, he said gently. She ran a joint credit card, David Fenster said vaguely, but I really don't spend. Books, pencils. I just design things. Mr. Perslake did not seem perturbed. I have several clients who leave financial matters to a partner, he replied. Mr. Fenster, you are a wealthy man. Your investments have done well. Your net worth is considerable. Eve could see that money still meant nothing to him. Maybe money will help a little as you come to terms with things, she said. You and Louise can feel secure. Your wife was astute, Mr. Perslake said, and frugal. She craved security for herself and for you. She talked about you all the time. David looked at her. I know why that was. Before she came to Scotland, she never knew where her next meal was coming from. So, Eve thought, Irina had been stashing away money for her old age and David's. Mr. Fenster stood. My taxi is sure to be here. I am pleased that I could pay my respects. I'll be in touch about future management when you are less upset. David shook his hand and left the room. Mr. Perslake was just setting off when he tapped his forehead. I quite forgot, he said. I have a gift for the bride. He drew out a small, wrapped present. You knew that Louise was getting married? Eve asked. Oh yes. Mrs. Fenster told me about all the arrangements. That is how I knew where she was. I called her landline to arrange to see her on her return, and the cleaning lady told me the terrible news. He shook his head. Irina consulted you about Louise's wedding? Eve asked. Only about how to fund the celebration. She was fond of her stepdaughter and wanted it to be perfect, within limits. I had a meeting with Mrs. Fenster about it in Glasgow. A wedding can involve a large spend and obviously she did not have the ready money. He smiled. The blushing bride was listening at the door. It's funny, the way the young don't notice the expenditure for such an event, he continued. Irina went to fetch coffee and Louise was upon me like a wild animal, asking questions. How much were her father and stepmom having to spend? Would it make a huge hole in their savings? I explained that she had no need to worry, that a big wedding wouldn't make any kind of hole. I think she felt relieved. Mr. Perslake's cab arrived, and as soon as he'd left the hotel, Eve and Dominic began talking. By the time Louise came back from her pedicure, laden with more shopping bags, they were waiting. They followed her up the stairs while she took the lift. Eve knocked on her door and Louise called out brightly, "Enter. Things to cheer you up?" Eve asked, looking at the bags as she walked in. "Definitely," Louise nodded. She saw Dominic behind Eve. "Why the bartender?" she asked. "Oh yeah, I forgot." She smiled. "The late-night wedding chapel. So funny." "Louise," Eve said as Dominic closed the door and took up position in front of it. "You know about your father's money?" "Not much," Louise replied, her cheeks tightening. "Mr. Perslake mentioned that you joined him at a meeting to discuss funding your wedding and learned quite a bit." Louise looked from Eve to Dominic. "Why is he here?" she repeated. If Irina had lived, Eve went on, ignoring the question, she would have got a share of David's money in due course. Louise's face was contorting into an ugly mixture of sulking and fear. "I've no idea. With Irina dead, your inheritance was secure. It was a long game, but you knew that a young wife could keep you from getting what you knew to be a lot of money." Eve ran her fingers along the glossy cord handles of the row of shopping bags and they bounced into position, one at a time. "Sometimes a person spends in anticipation of a windfall," she went on. "We are on to you, Louise. You killed Irina while wearing those ridiculous shoes because most of us were wearing them. It was a good move. It left the police confused." Eve felt suddenly miserable and angry. All that nonsense about wishing you had taken champagne in to Irina. You cared only about money. Dominic spoke up. "I never met you before this week, but I know you're a good actress." It was Dominic's comment that made Louise crumple. Soon she was a weeping, angry, confused mess. It was Eve who slipped out to call Detective Shaw. They were both exhausted that evening. Shaw's team had left at last, and the scent of Louise's $500 perfume had begun to fade. "Let's get out of here," Dominic suggested. It was a fine, cool evening, and they set off along Las Vegas Boulevard. "That just about wraps it up," Dominic remarked. "Yup," Eve agreed. They passed a low building made of creamy stone with a pointed spire. Eve stopped. "Is this where we—" "No," he laughed. "The Ivory Veil is further north." "I still feel embarrassed about it," she admitted. "Do you?" Eve listened to every note in his voice, hoping to find a hint of regret or a change of heart. She had realized something as they stepped out of the hotel together. She loved him. If only she hadn't gone and married him. They were standing looking at the chapel. "You're getting in a plane soon," he reasoned. "And if I don't say this now, I am going to regret it forever." "Eve, pen pals is not enough for me." She couldn't breathe. She tried to arrange her face in such a way as to make him keep talking, but he stopped talking and dropped to the pavement, down onto one knee. "Eve Dexter," he began, "will you marry me?" Again, "Yes, I will," she exclaimed, and tears came to her eyes. A woman came striding out of the building. "We have a gap in bookings right now," she said with a smile. "A cancellation, you're in luck." "Got your license?" "Absolutely not," Dominic replied. "This time it's got to be somewhere that isn't Vegas." The woman shrugged and went on her way, swinging her briefcase. The divorcees kissed. "How about Glasgow?" Eve suggested. "Sounds as good as anywhere," Dominic replied with a smile. He says, "Everything I say stays in this room." I nod and continue making notes. That is how it begins. Nothing is to leave the room, even though I am making notes, and he knows I will publish what he says because I tell him that. We are entering a place neither of us knows. I can never repeat what he tells me even though I tell him I will repeat it. Nothing must leave the room even though he watches me write his words down in a black notebook. I do not even know his name, nor can I verify the particulars of what he tells me. But this killer has come to me with a pedigree, established through the hands that delivered him to me. A man who once used him, a former cartel member and leading state policeman who now has produced him as a favor. He tells me to feel the tricep on his right arm. It hangs down like a tire. Now, he says, "Feel my left arm." There is nothing there. He stands, puts a chokehold on me. He can snap my neck like a twig. Then he sits down again. I ask him how much he would charge to kill me. He gives me a cool appraisal and says, "At the most, $5,000, probably less. You are powerless and you have no connections to power. No one would come after me if I killed you. We are ready to begin." I ask him how he became a killer. He smiles and says, "My arm grew." He takes a sheet of paper, draws 5 vertical lines, and writes in the spaces in black ink. Childhood, police, narco, God. The 4 phases of his life. Then he scratches out what he has written until there is nothing but solid ink on the page. He cannot leave tracks. He cannot quite give up the habits of a lifetime. I reach for the paper, but he snatches it back and laughs. I think at both of us. When I believed in the Lord, he says, I ran from the dead. I had a normal childhood, he insists. He will not tolerate the easy explanation that he is the product of abuse. We were very poor, very needy, he continues. We came to the border from the south to survive. My people went into the maquilas. I went to a university. I didn't have a father who treated me badly. My father worked, a working man. He started at the maquila at 6 p.m. and worked until 6 a.m., 6 days a week. The rest of the time he was sleeping. My mother had to be both father and mother. She cleaned houses in El Paso 3 days a week. There were 12 children to feed. He pauses here to see if I understand. He will not be a victim, not of poverty, not of parents. He became a killer because it was a way to live, not because of trauma. His eyes are clear and intelligent. And cold. Once, he says, my father took me and 3 of my brothers to the circus. We brought our own chilies and cookies so we did not have to spend money. That was the happiest day of my life. And the only time I went somewhere with my father. But now we turn to the time he worked for the devil. He is in high school when the state police recruit him and his friends. They get $50 to drive cars across the bridge to El Paso, where they park them and walk away. They never know what is in the cars, nor do they ever ask. After the delivery, they are taken to a motel where cocaine and women are always available. He drops out of the university because he has no money. And then the police dip into his set of friends who have been moving drugs for them to El Paso and send them to the police academy. In his own case, because he is only 17, the mayor of Juarez has to intervene to get him into the academy. We were paid about 150 pesos a month as cadets, he says, but we got a bonus of $1,000 a month that came from El Paso. Every day, liquor and drugs came to the academy for parties. Each weekend, we bribed the guards and went to El Paso. I was sent to the FBI school in the United States and taught how to detect drugs, guns, and stolen vehicles. The training was very good. After graduation, no one in the various departments really wanted him because he was too young, but U.S. law enforcement insisted he be given a command position. And so he was. I commanded 8 people, he continues. 2 were honest and good. The other 6 were into drugs and kidnapping. 2 units of the state police in Juarez specialized in kidnapping, and his was one such unit. The official assignment of both units was to stop kidnapping. In reality, one unit would kidnap the person and then hand the victim over to the other unit to be killed, a procedure less time-consuming than guarding the victim until the ransom was paid. Sometimes they would feign discovering the body a few days after the abduction. That was the orderly Juarez he once knew. Then in July 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the head of the Juarez cartel, died. This was an earthquake. Order broke down. The payments to the state police from an account in the United States ended. And each unit had to fend for itself. I have no real idea how and when I became a sicario, he says. At first, I picked up people and handed them over to killers. And then my arm began to grow because I strangled people. I could earn $20,000 a killing. Before Carrillo's death, cocaine was not easy for him to get in Juarez because if you cut open a kilo, you died. So he and his crew would cross the bridge to El Paso and score. He is by now running a crew of kidnappers and killers. He is working for a cartel that stores tons of cocaine in Juarez warehouses, and he must enter the United States to get his drugs. That changed after Carrillo's death. Soon he was deep into cocaine, amphetamines, and liquor and would stay up for a week. He also acquired his skill set. Strangulation, killing with a knife, killing with a gun, car-to-car barges, torture, kidnapping, and simply disappearing people and burying them in holes. He mentions the case of Victor Manuel Oropeza, a doctor who wrote a column for the newspaper. He linked the police and the drug world. He was knifed to death in his office in 1991. The people who killed him taught me. Sicarios are not born, they are made. He became a new man in a new world. In the eyes of the U.S. government, the Mexican drug industry is very organized. Its cartels structured like corporations, perhaps with periodic meetings. But on the ground with the sicario, there is no structure. He kills all over Mexico, he works with various groups, but he never knows how things are linked, he never meets the people in charge, and he never asks any questions. And so he visits the various outposts of this underground empire, but does so without any map and with no directory of the management. He is in a cell and can betray only the handful of people in his cell. He will never even be certain which cartel organization pays him. He tells me of a leader, a deputy of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, the current head of the Juarez cartel, a man full of hate, a man who even hates his own family. He would cut up a baby in front of the father in order to make the father talk. He says the man is a beast. He is drifting now, going back in time to a place he has left, the killing ground where he would slaughter and then drop $5,000 in a single evening. He remembers when outsiders would try to move into Juarez and commandeer the plaza, the crossing. For a while, the organization killed them and hung them upside down. Then, for a spell, they offered Colombian necties, the throat cut, tongue dangling through the slit. There was a spate of necklacing, the burned body found with a charred stub where the head had been, the metal cords of the tire simply blackened hoops embracing the corpse. He has lived like a god and been the destroyer of worlds. The room is still, so very still, the television a blank eye, the walls sedated with beige, the exhaust fan purring. His arms at rest on the wood table, everything solid and calm. But his face is fear. Not fear of me but of something neither of us can define. A death machine with no apparent driver. There is no headquarters for him to avoid. No boss to keep an eye peeled for. He has been green-lighted, and now anyone who knows of the contract can kill him on sight and collect the money. The name of his killer is Legion. He can hide, but that only buys a little time, and he is allowed only one serious mistake and then he is dead. His hunters can be patient. He is like a winning lottery ticket and one day they will collect. The death machine careens through the streets, guns at the ready, always rolling, no real route, randomly prowling and looking for fresh blood. The day comes and goes and 10 die. Or more. No one can really keep count any longer, and besides, some of the bodies simply vanish and cannot be tallied. He stares at me. He says, "I want to talk about God." I say, "We'll get to that." He is the killer and he does not know who is in charge. Just as he usually did not know the reason for the murders he committed. He will die. Someone will kill him. No one will really notice. No place is safe, he knows that fact. A family in the States owed some money on a deal, so a 14-year-old son and his friend were snatched and taken back over. The man killed them with a broken bottle, then drank a glass of their blood. He knows things like that, because of what he has done. He knows that crossing the bridge is easy because he has crossed it so many times. He knows all the searches and all the security claims at the border are a joke because he has moved with his weapons back and forth. He knows that everything has been penetrated, that nothing can be trusted, not even the solid feel of the wooden table. The rough edge of burning wood fires at those shacks of the poor, the acrid smell of burned powder flowing from a spent brass cartridge, an old copper kettle with oil boiling and fresh pork swirling into the crispness of carnitas, the caravan of cars passing in the night, windows tinted, and then the entire procession turns and comes by again, and you look but do not stare, because if they pause, however briefly, they will take you with them to the death that waits, the holes being dug each morning in the brown dirt of the Campo Santo, the graves a guess and a promise gaping up like hungry mouths for the kills of the morning and afternoon and evening. And 4 people sit outside their house at night, and the cars come by, the bullets bark, 2 die soon after the barrage, and the other 2 are scooped up by family who drive them from hospital to hospital through the dark houses because no healers will take them in. The killers have a way of following their prey into the emergency rooms in order to finish the work. His arms are on the wooden table as Juarez wafts across our faces, and we do not speak of this fact. I cannot explain the draw of the city that gives death but makes everyone feel life. Nor can he. So we do not speak but simply note this fact with our silence. We are both trying to return to some person we imagine we once were, the person before the killings, before the torture, before the fear. He wants to live without the power of life and death, and wonders if he can endure being without the money. I want to obliterate memory, to be in a world where I do not know of sicarios and think of dinner and not of fresh corpses decorating the calles. We have followed different paths and wound up in the same plaza, and now we sit and talk and wonder how we will ever get home. I crossed the river about 20 years ago. I can't be exact about the date because I am still not sure what crossing really means, except that you never come back. I just know I crossed, and now I stumble on some distant shore. It is like killing. I ask him, "Tell me about your first killing," and he says he can't remember, and I know that he is not telling the truth, and I know that he is not lying. Sometimes you cannot reach it. You open that drawer, and your hand is paralyzed and you cannot reach it. It is right in front of you, but still you cannot reach it, and so you say you don't remember. He has a green pen, a notebook. He has printouts from the internet, mainly things about me. He has spent 10 hours researching me, he says. Like so many pilgrims, he is in the market for a witness who can understand his life. He has decided I will suffice. He is at ease now. Before, his body was hunched over, shoulders looming, those trained and talented hands. He wore a skullcap that hid his hair, and he seldom smiled. Now he is a different person, a man who laughs, his body almost fluid, his eyes no longer dead black coals but beaming and dancing as he speaks. We are not monsters, he explains. We have education, we have feelings. I would leave torturing someone, go home and have dinner with my family, and then return. You shut off parts of your mind. It is a kind of work, you follow orders. For some time, his past life has been dead to him, something he shut off. But now it is back. He thinks God has sent me to convey his lessons to others. Like all of us, he wants his life to have meaning, and I am to write it down and send it out into the world. Of course, he must be careful. When he left the life 2 years ago, the organization put a $250,000 contract on his life. He does not know what the contract currently is, but it is unlikely to be lower. At the moment, God is protecting him and his family, he knows this, but still he must be careful. I don't do bad things anymore, he says, but I can't stop being careful. It is a habit I have. That's how I ensure security for myself. They killed me twice, you know. And he lifts his shirt to show me 2 groupings of bullet holes in his belly from separate times when he took rounds from an AK-47. I was in a coma for a while, he continues. I weighed 290 pounds when I went into the hospital, a narco hospital, and I shrank to 120 pounds. It was all a mistake. The organization believed he had leaked information on the killing of a newspaper columnist, but it turned out the actual informant had been the guy paid to tap phones. So he was killed, and they apologized to me and paid for a month's vacation in Mazatlan with women, drugs, and liquor. I was about 24 then. He sips his coffee. He is ready to begin. He notes that when I asked him earlier about his first killing, he said he couldn't really remember because he used so much cocaine and drank so much alcohol back then. That was a lie. He remembers quite well. The first person I killed, well, we were state policemen doing a patrol, he says. They called my partner on his cell phone and told him the person we were looking for was in a mall. So we went and got him and put him in the car. Two guys get in the car, identify the target, and leave. They are people paying for the murder. He and his partner use the police code for a homicide. When the number 39 is spoken, it means to kill the person. The guy they have picked up has lost 10 kilos of cocaine, drugs that belong to the other two men. His partner drives and he gets in back with the victim. The target says that he gave the drugs to someone else. At that moment his partner says 39, and so he instantly kills him. It was like automatic, he explains. They drive around for hours with the body and they drink. Finally, they go to an industrial park, pry off a manhole, and throw the body in the sewer. For his work, he gets an ounce of coke, a bottle of whiskey, and $1,000. They told me I had passed the test. I was 18. He checks into a hotel and does cocaine and drinks for 4 days. The state police didn't care if you were drunk. If you really wanted to be left alone, you gave the dispatcher 100 pesos and then they would not call you at all. After this baptism, he moves into kidnapping and enters a new world. Soon he is traveling all over Mexico. He is working for the police, but whenever an assignment comes up he simply gets leave. A few of the kidnappings he participates in are merely snatches for ransom. But hundreds of others have a different goal. They would say, take this guy. He lost 200 kilos of marijuana and didn't pay. I would pick him up in my police car. I would drop him off at a safe house. A few hours later, I would get a call that said there is a dead body to get rid of. This was at the start of my career after I passed my test. For about 3 years I traveled all over Mexico. Once I even went to Quintana Roo. I always had an official police car. Sometimes we used planes, but usually we drove. We got through military checkpoints by showing an official document that said we were transporting a prisoner. The document would have a fake case number. He becomes a tour guide to an alternate Mexico, a place where citizens are transported from safe house to safe house without any records left for courts and agencies. When he arrives someplace, the person has already been kidnapped. He simply picks him up for shipment. Controlling them was easy because they were terrified. When they saw that it was an official car and when I said, don't worry, everything will be fine. You'll be back with your family. If you don't cooperate, we'll drug you and put you in the trunk and I can't guarantee then that you'll see the end of the journey. The drive is fueled by coke. He and his partner always dress well for such work. They get 5 or 6 new suits from the organization every few months. They are seldom home but seem to live in various safe houses and are supplied with food and drugs. But no women. This is all business. They hardly ever do police work. They are working full-time for narcos. This is his real home for almost 20 years. A second Mexico that does not exist officially and that coexists seamlessly with the government. In his many transports of human beings to bondage, torture, and death, he is never interfered with by the authorities. He is part of the government, the state policeman with 8 men under his command. But his key employer is the organization, which he assumes is the Juarez cartel. But he never asks since questions can be fatal. They give him a salary, a house, a car, and standing. He estimates that 85% of the police worked for the organization. But even on a clear day, he could barely glimpse the cartel that employed him. He is in a cell, and above him is a boss, and above that boss is a region of power he never visits or knows. He also estimates that out of every 100 human beings he transports, maybe 2 make it back to their former lives. The rest die. Slowly, very slowly. In each safe house, there would be anywhere from 5 to 15 kidnap victims. They wore blindfolds all the time, and if their blindfolds slipped, they were killed. At times, they would be put in a chair facing a television. Their eyes would be briefly uncovered, and they would watch videos of their children going to school, their wives shopping, the family at church. They would see the world they had left behind, and they would know this world would vanish, be destroyed, if they did not come through with the money. The neighbors never complained about the safe houses. They would see they might owe $1 million, but when the work was finished they would pay everything, their entire fortunes, and maybe, just maybe, the wife would be left with a house and a car. People would be held for up to 2 years. They were beaten after they were fed, and so they learned to associate food with pain. Once in a great while, the order would come down to release a prisoner. They would be taken to a park blindfolded, told to count to 50 before they opened their eyes. Even at this moment of freedom, They would weep because they no longer believed it possible for them to be released and still expected to be murdered. Sometimes, he says, prisoners who had been held for months would be allowed to remove the blindfolds so they could clean the safe house. After a while, they began to think they were part of the organization, and they identified with the guards who beat them. They would even make up songs about their experiences as prisoners, and they would tell us of all the fine things they would make sure we got when they were released. Sometimes after beating them badly, we would send their families videos of them, and they would be pleading, saying, "Give them everything," and then the order would come down and they would be killed. Payment to the organization would always be made in a different city from where the prisoner was held. Everything in the organization was compartmentalized. Often he would stay in a safe house for weeks and never speak to a prisoner or know who they were. It did not matter. They were products and he was a worker following orders. No matter how much the family paid, the prisoner almost always died. When the family had been sucked dry of money, the prisoner had no value. And besides, he could betray the organization. So death was logical and inevitable. He pauses in his account. He wants it understood that he is now similar to the prisoners he tortured and killed. He is outside the organization, he is a threat to the organization, and everyone who is no longer of use to the boss dies. He is now the floating man remembering when he was firmly anchored in his world. I want it understood, he says, that I had feelings when I was in the torture houses and people would be lying in their vomit and blood. I was not permitted to help them. He is calm as he says this. He alternates between asserting his humanity and explaining how he maintained a professional demeanor while he kidnapped, tortured, and killed people. He says he is feared now because he believes in God. Then he says he could make a good grouping on the target with his AK-47 at 800 yards. He would practice at military bases and police academies. He could get in using his police badge. The work, he insists, is not for amateurs. Take torture, you must know just how far to go. Even if you intend to kill the person in the end, you must proceed carefully in order to get the necessary information. They are so afraid, he explains, they are usually cooperative. Sometimes when they realize what is going to happen to them, they become aggressive. Then you take their shoes away, soak their clothes, and put a hot wire to each foot for 15 seconds. Then they understand that you are in charge and that you are going to get the information. You can't beat them too much because then they become insensitive to pain. I have seen people beaten so badly that you could pull out their fingernails with pliers and they wouldn't feel it. You handcuff them behind their backs, sit them in a chair facing a 100-watt bulb, and you ask them questions about their jobs, number, and age of children. All things you have researched and know the answer to. Every time they lie, you give them a jolt from an electric cattle prod. Once they realize they can't lie, you start asking them the real questions. How many loads have they moved to the US? Who do they work for? And if they are not paying your boss, well, why? They will try by this point to answer everything. Then we beat them and let them rest. We show them those videos of their family. At this point, they will give up anything we ask for and even more. Now you have the advantage, and you use this new information to hit warehouses and steal loads, to round up other people they work with, and then you video their families and begin the process again. You know the families will not likely go to the police because they know the guy is in a bad business. But if they do tell the police, we instantly know because we work with the police. We're part of the anti-kidnapping unit. Sometimes the people kidnapped are killed instantly because, after we take their jewelry and cars, they are worthless. Such goods are divided up within the unit, among 5 to 8 people. The hardest thing is when you kill them because then you must dig a hole to bury them. There are 2 mistakes most people make. They don't pay whoever controls the plaza, the city, or they dreamed of being bigger than the boss. But none of this really matters because he never asks why people are kidnapped, nor who they really are. They are simply product and he is simply a worker. Their screams are simply the background noise to the task at hand. Just as calming them or transporting them is simply part of the job. There is a second category of kidnapping, one he finds almost embarrassing. Someone's wife is having an affair with her personal trainer, so you pick up the trainer and kill him. Or a guy has a hot woman and some other guy wants her, so you kill the boyfriend to get the woman for him. I received my orders, he says, and I had to kill them. The bosses didn't know what the limits were. If they want a woman, they get her. If they want a car, they get it. They have no limits. He resents people who like to kill. They are not professional. Real sicarios kill for money, but there are people who kill for fun. People will say, I haven't killed anyone for a week, so they'll go out and kill someone. This kind of person does not belong in organized crime. They're crazy. If you discover such a person in your unit, you kill him. The people you really want to recruit are police or ex-police, trained killers. All this is a sore point for him. The slaughter now going on in Juarez offends him because too many of the killings are done by amateurs, by kids imitating sicarios. He is appalled by the number of bullets used in a single execution. It shows a lack of training and skill. In a real hit, the burst goes right where the lock is on the door because such rounds will penetrate the driver's torso with a killing shot. Twice he was stymied by armored vehicles, but the solution is a burst of full-jacketed rounds in a tight pattern. This will gouge through the armor. A hit should take no more than a minute. Even his hardest jobs against armored cars took under 3 minutes. A real sicario, he notes, does not kill women or children, unless the women are informants for the DEA or the FBI. Here he must show me. A proper execution requires planning. First, the eyes study the target for days, usually at least a week. His schedule at home is noted: when he gets up, when he leaves for work, when he comes home. Everything about his routines in his domestic life is recorded by the eyes. Then the mind takes over. He studies the man's habits in the city itself. His day at work, where he lunches, where he drinks, how often he visits his mistress and where she lives and what her habits are. Between the eyes and the mind a portrait is possible. Now there is a meeting of the crew, which is 6 to 8 people. There will be 2 police cars with officers and 2 other cars with sicarios. A street will be selected for the hit, one that can easily be blocked off. Timing will be carefully worked out, and the hit will take place within a half-dozen blocks of a safe house. An easy matter since there are so many in the city. He picks up a pen and starts drawing. The lead car will be police. Then will come a car full of sicarios. Then the car driven by the target. This is followed by another car of underscore sicarios. Underscore, and then, bringing up the rear, another police car. During the execution, the eyes will watch and the mind will man the radios. When the target enters the block selected for the murder, the lead police car will pivot and block the street. The first sicario will slow. The second car of sicarios behind the target will pull up beside him and shoot him. The final police car will block the end of the street. All this should take less than 30 seconds. One man will get out and give a coup de grace to the bullet-riddled victim. Then all will disperse. The car with the killers will go to the safe house and leave their vehicle in a garage. It will be taken to a garage owned by the organization, repainted, and then sold on one of the organization's lots. The killers themselves will pick up a clean car at the safe house, and often they return to the scene of the murder to see that everything has gone well. He sketches this with exactness. Each rectangle neatly drawn to delineate a car, and the target's car is filled in and blooms on the page with green ink. Arrows indicate how each vehicle will move. It is like an equation on a chalkboard. He leans back from his toil, and on his face is almost the look of a job well done. This is how a real sicario performs his work. In the ideal hit, no target is left alive. Should any in the group be injured, they go to one of the organization's hospitals. If you can buy a governor, you can buy a hospital. I never knew the names of the people I was involved with, he continues. There was a person who directed our group and he knew everything. But if your job is to execute people, that is all you do. You don't know the reasons or names. I would be in a safe house with the kidnapped for a month and never speak to them. Then, if I was told to kill them, we would take them to the place where they would be killed, take off their clothes. We would kill them exactly the way we were ordered, a bullet to the neck, acid on the bodies. There would be cases where you would be killing someone, strangling them, and they would stop breathing, and you would get a call, don't kill them. And so you would have to know how to resuscitate them, or we would be killed because the boss never makes a mistake. Everything is contained and sealed. For a while they used crazy kids to steal cars for the work, but the kids, about 40 of them, got too arrogant, talking and selling drugs in the nightclubs. This violated an agreement with the governor of Chihuahua to keep the city quiet. So one night around 10 years ago, 50 police and 150 guys from the organization who were to ensure the job was done rounded up all the kids on Avenida Juarez. They were not tortured. They were killed with a single headshot and buried in one hole. No, he smiles at me. I will not tell you where that hole is. He has trouble remembering some things. I would get up in the morning and do a line, he explains, then have a glass of whiskey. Then I would go to lunch. I would never sleep more than a few hours, little naps. It is hard to sleep during a time of war. Even if my eyes were closed, I was alert. I slept with a loaded AK-47 on one side, a .38 on the other. The safeties were always off. Do I know of the death houses, he asks. It would take a book to do the death houses. After all, I know where 600 bodies are buried in safe houses in Juarez. There is one death house they have never revealed that I know has 56 bodies. Just as there is a rancho where the officials say they found 2 bodies, but I know that rancho has 32 corpses. If the police really investigated, they would find bodies. But obviously, you cannot trust the police. He especially wants to know what I know about the 2 death houses uncovered last winter. I say one had 9 bodies, the other 36. No, he insists the second one had 38, 2 of them women. He carefully draws me the layout of this second death house. One of the women, he notes, was killed for speaking too much. The other was a mistake. These do happen, though the bosses never admit to it. But he keeps returning to the death house with the 38 bodies. It has memories for him. I remember standing on the quiet dirt street as the authorities made a show of digging up the dead. Half a mile away was a hospital where some machine gun people were taken that spring, but the killers followed and killed them in the emergency room. Shot their kinfolk in the waiting room also. The narcos, he wants me to understand, have informants in the DEA and the FBI. They work until they are useless. Then they are killed. As for those who inform to the FBI and DEA, they die ugly, he explains. They were brought handcuffed behind the back to the death house where they found 36 bodies. He rolls on. A t-shirt was soaked with gasoline and put on their backs, lit, and then after a while pulled from their backs. The skin came off with it. Both men made sounds like cattle being killed. They were injected with a drug so they would not lose consciousness. Then they put alcohol on their testicles and lit them. They jumped so high. They were handcuffed, and still I never saw people jump so high. We are slipping now. All the masks have fallen to the floor. The veteran, the professional sicario, is walking me through a key assignment he completed. Their backs were like leather and did not bleed. They put plastic bags on their heads to smother them and then revive them with alcohol under their noses. All they ever said to us was, "We will see you in hell." This went on for 3 days. They smelled terrible because of the burns. They brought in a doctor to keep reviving them. They wanted them to live one more day. After a while they defecated blood. They shoved broomsticks up their asses. The second day a person came and told them, "I warned you this was going to happen." They said, "Kill us." The guys lived 3 days. The doctor kept injecting them to keep them alive, and he had to work hard. Eventually they died of the torture. They never asked God for help. They just kept saying, "We will see you in hell." I buried them with their faces down and poured on a whole lot of lime. He is excited. It is all back. He can feel the shovel in his hand. He is calm now. He is revisiting this evil time, he says, simply for my benefit. He takes his various drawings, how to do a hit where some people were buried in a death house, looks at the green schematics he has created, and then slowly tears them into little squares until the torn heap can never be reconstructed. Until late 2006, he worked all over Mexico for different groups, and the various organizations generally got along. There were small moments, such as when others tried to take over Juarez and it was necessary to necklace them. But his life in the main was calm. So calm he did not need to know who he really worked for. I received orders from 2 people. They ran me. I never knew which cartel I worked for. Now there is Vicente Carrillo against Chapo Guzman. That is, Joaquin Guzman Lora, head of Mexico's largest cartel. But I never met any bosses, so when the war started around 2006, I did not know which one I did the killing for. And orders could cross from one group to another. I am living in a cell and I simply take orders. In 30 minutes in Juarez, 60 well-trained and heavily armed men can assemble in 30 cars and circulate as a show of force. Then, at my level, we began to get orders to kill each other. He is kidnapped but let go after an hour. This unsettles him. and he begins to think about escaping his life. But that is not a simple matter, since if you leave you are murdered. As the war escalates, he begins to distance himself from people he knows and works with. He tries to fade away. By this time, a third of the people he knows have been killed. They were seen as useless and then killed. He doesn't know the boss, he is still not even sure who his boss is. He drinks at home. The streets are too dangerous. New people arrive and he does not know them. He is not safe. So he flees. He confides in a friend, who betrays him. He pauses at this point. He knows he is guilty of a fatal error. He has violated a fundamental rule. You can be betrayed only by someone you trust. So you survive by trusting no one. Still, there is this shred of humanity in all of us. And in the end we feel the need to trust someone, to call someone friend, to share feelings with others. And this need is fatal. It is the very need he has exploited for years. The need he used when he put people in the police car and told them they would be all right if they cooperated, would be back with their families in no time if they were calm. And by God, they did trust him and rode across Mexico, went through checkpoints and said nothing, never told a single soul they had been kidnapped. They would trust him as they were tortured in the safe houses. They would help mop the floors, clean up the vomit and blood. They would compose songs. They would trust him right up to that instant when he strangled them. So his friend gives him up. He is taken at 10 p.m., and this time he is held until 3 a.m. But something has changed within him, and some things have not changed. For men take him to a safe house. They remove all of his clothing but his shorts. They take pool balls in their hands and beat him. But he can tell they are amateurs. They do not even handcuff him, and this is disturbing to him. He is the captive of third-raters. As they beat him, he prays and prays and prays. He also laughs because he is appalled by their incompetence. They have not bound him, and their blows do not disable him. He sizes them up and in his mind plans how he will kill them 1, 2, 3, 4, just like that. And at the same moment, he is praying to God to help him so that he will not kill them, so that he can stop his life of murder. As he sits in the room, sipping coffee and recalling this moment, his face comes alive. He is passionate now. He is approaching the very moment of his salvation. Some people pretend to accept Christ, he says, but at that moment he could feel total acceptance fill his body. He could feel peace. They point rifles at him. He cannot stop laughing. I was afraid, he explains. I realized I would have to kill them all. 2 of the armed men left. 1 other guy went to the bathroom. He looks at the remaining captor. The guy says, I don't have a problem with you. Once you told me to be careful or they would kill me. You did me a favor. So, I am praying to God. Help me. I don't want to kill these people. And I know I can do it rapidly. The guy turns his back on me and says, get out, go. He opens the door and runs without his shoes or clothes. His face is stern now. He has come to the place, the very moment that has permitted him to recount the kidnappings, the tortures, the killings. He is selling, and what he is selling is God. He is believing, and what he believes based on his own life is that anyone can be redeemed, and that it is possible to leave the organization and survive. His thoughts are a jumble as he speaks. He is telling of his salvation, and yet he feels the tug of his killings. He feels the pride in being feared. Back at the beginning, when he first started with the state police, that was when Oropesa, the doctor and newspaper columnist, was killed. And Oropesa's killers, he now recalls, were his mentors, his teachers. He remembers that after the murder, the state government announced a big investigation to get the killers. And one of them, a fellow cop, stayed at his own police station until the noise quieted and the charade ended. He is excited now. He is living in his past. The only reason I am here is God saved me. I repented. After all these years I am talking to you. I am having to relive things that are dead to me. I don't want to be part of this life. I don't want to know the news. You must write this so that other sicarios know it is possible to leave. They must know God can help them. They are not monsters. They have been trained like special forces in the army. But they never realize they have been trained to serve the devil. Imagine being 19 and being able to call up a plane. I liked the power. I never realized until God talked to me that I could get out. Still, when God frees me, I remain a wolf. I can't become a lamb. I remain a terrible person, but now I have God on my side. He stares at me as I write in a black notebook. His body seems to loom over the table. This is the point in all stories where everyone discovers who they really are. He says, I have now relived something I should never have opened up. Are you the medium to reach others? I prayed to God asking what I should do, and you are the answer. You are going to write this story because God has a purpose in you writing this story. God has given you this mission. No one will understand this story except those who have been in the life. And God will tell you how to write this story. Then we embrace and pray. I can feel his hand on my shoulder probing,